som det är på vanlig debatt i riksdagen då, så inga applåder eller demonstrationer. Vi får fotografera självklart, fast utan blick. Och det får inte hänga vid själva kanten. Precis, vi måste hålla den innan. Och mobiltelefon givetvis. Bra. Så om det skulle vara något mer så vill gå över på den sidan där. Vi kan även om du ser de här vissa sidonocken precis bakom talmannen som man kan stå bakom där och ett av de två. Så skulle du vilja gå in i någon av de här fotoblöggarna så se om det skulle vara bra och så ser det som en lucka. Det är där mitten. Man ser en sån här kanter. Där kan man också stå för att man stoppa bakåt. Gör det. Men som sagt, vill du dit eller vill du över på andra sidan så bara kom upp.
Klockan är 9.
It is 9 o'clock sharp. It is time to reconvene. Item 1, the debate of party leaders. Debating rules. In the first round, the Prime Minister and the leader of the Moderate Party are entitled to a speech of no more than 7 minutes, and the other party leaders are entitled to a speech of no more than 5 minutes. The speeches are given in the order of relative size of the parties, and there is no right of reply or rejoinder to these first speeches. This is then followed by a second round, during which all the participants in the debate are entitled to speak for no more than 2 minutes, and there is a free right of reply to those speeches, and the rejoinders are taken in the order of relative size of the parties. The time allowed for each rejoinder is limited to 1 minute in accordance with the so-called dueling method. In other words, a total of 4 minutes per duel. From the rostrum and the podium up here, rejoinders from the smaller speaking points. From the Social Democratic Party, Prime Minister Stefan Löfven is the first speaker of the day. You have the floor.
Herr talman, jag tror att
Mr. Speaker, I think many people will remember the year 2016 as a year of turbulence and worry, when all the positive things in the world, such as decreasing poverty and higher levels of education, were competed by increasing temperatures, turbulence, climate threats, a crueler, colder, more hate-ish world, generally speaking. But it differs between people as well. I'm talking about the worry you feel if you live in an area tormented by increased crime rates. You're afraid to go out at night. I'm talking to you who's retired after working for many years, and still you're wondering if you're going to be able to afford a new winter coat after you've paid all of this month's bills. And perhaps you're worried even if you're in a good place financially, but you see how your child or grandchild is looking at you, and you look back and you wonder about the school you're sending this child to and the world this young person is growing up in. That's the worry we want to deal with. We want to meet you. We want to strengthen your confidence in the future. What could be more important in a democracy? Sweden is progressing in the world right now. Our employment rate is at its highest ever measured by Eurostat in an EU country, and the schools are finally showing a breakthrough, a trend shift internationally. And if we look at our economy, we see that there's more housing being built than we've seen for many decades now. And the second most innovative economy in the world was an award given to the Swedish economy only recently. Mr. Speaker, the force we witness in the Swedish economy right now must be used to construct and build a society which will benefit everyone, which can reach out to suburban areas, to rural areas, lifting people out of despair and hopelessness, giving everyone who can work an opportunity to do so. We construct our society in honour of the generations that built it, ensuring that there's care for the elderly, housing, strengthening the financial position of our retirees so that they feel not just comfort but also confidence. After many years of cutbacks, we now want to start focus on the total defence and invest more in it, supporting social workers, nurses, preschool workers, ensuring that they can go to work strong, proud, capable of providing the welfare we all want to be able to rely upon. Calm and peace to study in our schools, in line with the Minister of Education, Gustav Frölin, and myself have presented today, developing the leadership skills and abilities of teachers in the classroom with support from colleagues and principals and headmasters, ensuring that every school has a well-functioning set of rules when it comes to orderliness. I refuse to allow Sweden's increasing resources being centred to the wealthiest, those who are the most privileged. It should be used in favour of constructing a society allowing the whole country and its entire population to live and be a vibrant one. This also means that we must never give in, not even an inch, to organised crime. Previously, we have and we will continue to strengthen the efforts of the police sector in relation to the organised crimes. It's easier to confiscate the assets of these organised groups. It's going to be easier to deal with, we were going to strengthen the weapons legislation so that people who are guilty of crimes in that area will know that they might have to stay in prison for a longer time. When I speak to the police investigating the act against the 8-year-old boy in Gothenburg, we're also asking for stricter legislation against hand grenades. So the minimum penalty for carrying a hand grenade will be quadrupled, I can announce to you here today, regardless of whether criminal elements have a gun or a hand grenade on their person. They will be remanded in custody. Organised criminals will be removed from our streets and into our prison facilities. That's the way it's going to be in this country. And who in this room, in this hall, can honestly say that what we need in Sweden in terms of construction of the society can be best done by lowering wages for the poorest, improving matters for the most privileged, and increasing gaps? The moderate party appears to be of that opinion. In spite of the fact that they're talking about people's worries, they keep presenting the same old moderate party policies over and over again, where the most privileged remain the winners. The Sweden Democrats have announced that they're happy to assist in implementing such a scheme if they can just get their share of the power. I have never met an individual who is safer from getting paid less, from having some of their opportunities for education taken away from them. Worry does not come from people expecting less from the society we all share. They expect more. And this is why the Swedish model mustn't be dismantled. It will be developed further, rather. The political fight in 2017 will be focused on that point. We won't introduce new cutbacks, making it even harder for people, getting them more worried. We're going to build a society which will strengthen people's belief in the future. That's my choice. That's the choice of the Social Democratic Party, of the government. And, Mr. Speaker, I am proud of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next speaker, Anna Kinberg Batra from the Moderate Party. Please, floor is yours.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, delegates and all those present. Liane had awaited this evening for such a long time. For the first time ever, she was going abroad with 3 friends, and they flew to Istanbul, and they went to a nightclub, the nightclub Reina, to celebrate the new year. Liana Asar was a Palestinian, and she was only 18 years old, and she was just one more victim of terrorists, where 39 people from 14 countries died, and IS have said that they were guilty of this crime. And a couple of days later, a lorry drove into a group of people in Jerusalem, and many people died. Terrorists today are against the way we live our lives, but we have to defend what we believe in. An open, democratic society where both men and women may have their place. A society where what's important isn't what you are or where you come from, but where, in fact, you are heading. Mr. Speaker, in just a couple of years, the world has become a much more dangerous place. If you believe that the refugee crisis is over, is naive. The war in Syria is in its 7th year, and an aggressive Russia has made the world around us more dangerous. So we can't just stand here and present a long list of problems and then say that's a strategy. We need action today. Which is why I want Sweden already now in the spring budget to give the 500 million extra in allocations to defence in above what has already been decided. I want to reinforce defence in Sweden by 8.5 billion before the next defence decision, because the threats and this situation is deteriorating as we speak. We need security together with other countries. We need to reinforce our own position and also cooperation within the EU, but that doesn't suffice. Cooperation with NATO is decisive in order to create stability and also safety and security in the world around us here. But Sweden also needs a map for and to take us into NATO. Mr. Speaker, this sense of insecurity isn't just in the world just around us here. It was only 1 o'clock in the day when Salom Koda and they closed their shops in Husby shopping centre, because time after time they'd been subject to crime and vandalism, and the police investigations were closed, and it felt as if these gangs had taken over. So the traders in Husby, they had a requirement. We want the police and the politicians to protect their citizens. And this, of course, sounds self-evident. Unfortunately, that's not the case today. Husby, unfortunately, is not the only place where we have this sense of insecurity. Brå, in fact, presented its figures about this sense of security. Every third woman feels a sense of security in their own where they live. We need at least 2,000 more police officers. They need 2,000 more krona a month, but that's not enough. We also need new management for the police. The organisation is not the response to every single problem, but the government is responsible for central structures and functions in society that they work. And so the government, and who is responsible for the government? That's Stefan Löfven. So we need to have the sense of security for everybody. We need to gain the ground from these criminal gangs, and we have to put the criminals in prison. Mr. Speaker, the whole of Sweden needs to have work, but there are 130 areas where not even 50% of the people go to work on an ordinary day, and where there are fewer jobs, and where they're more and more dependent on benefits, which has a consequence not just on the individuals, but in fact on society as a whole. In Södertälje, for example, we see the municipality pay more for benefits for people who don't work than it does for to pay teachers in preschools. In Malmö, the municipality pay 3 times as much in benefits for people who don't work than they pay teachers' salaries in upper secondary education. And this is, we have... You, the Social Democrats, you take from those who work and give to those who don't work. And there are examples where families, when we see that their pay is reduced when mothers take a part-time job. And we see that that people can in fact get 28,000 krona in benefits after tax, and that's not reasonable. Because I'm convinced that almost all of these want to work instead, and But we need to stop just helping these people who live off others when they in fact could support themselves, which is why we need a ceiling for benefits and lower taxes on the first job and clear requirements on getting a job. Having a job should be more beneficial than living off benefits. Mr. Speaker, it's 18 years ago Samir took his car to Borås, knocked on the door at Ericsson and said that he wasn't unemployed anymore. And he said his job was his second home, but now that plant is being closed. Swedish industry has for a long time been very strong. It's created jobs, and as a Swede you're very, proud that when the bus in India is from Scania. But the Ericsson crisis in fact reminds us of the fact that the pressure on Swedish jobs is very, very harsh. Competition from other countries, new technology, which is why we see that we might lose out here. We might be lagging behind. And now the government is going to increase taxes by 60 billion for every single krona that they say that they're investing in entrepreneurship. They take 10 krona from things that in fact create jobs. They increase taxes on diesel, petrol, aviation. So we're going in the wrong direction. My plan for a stronger Sweden, we do the other way around, because it should always benefit you to have a job, and we need to invest and help ensure that schools improve, and we need to create Swedish jobs here in Sweden. This is the only way that we can do away with marginalisation. The whole of Sweden should have a job. This is the only way that we can see the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Jimmy Åkesson for the Sweden Democrats. You have the floor.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, it is now 2017. It has been for about a week, and I think the time is right to say a few words about the year gone by. In 2016, in our part of the world, we witnessed a popular rising against the dominated left-wing Liberal Party establishment, which has been dominated. The US presidential election and the referendum in the UK are the two almost obvious examples. We've seen how the EU at home has been pushed back. The hope against the IS, the threats to the IS have grown. The hope of an end to the murdering Islamist sect is finally a hope, and we've also witnessed other things, horrific attacks against us and our civilization closer to home, attacks on our way of life, in fact. The aggressions from Russia, a potential threat which no other party in this chamber took seriously until only very recently. This has become only ever more tangible, and more room is afforded to it in the political debate. War and misery in Syria in particular have continued to create suffering. The UNHCR announced in 2016 that the number of refugees across the world has now exceeded 65 million people. Most of them remain in the vicinity of crises. That's hard to believe, though, when you listen to the Swedish domestic political debate. And speaking of the domestic arena, we've seen a fairly broad sobering up in immigration policies, as it were. Steps and measures have been taken in the right direction, even though they haven't been sufficient by far, and they've come way too late. The debate on integration has taken a shift in the right direction as well. Suddenly, more or less, everyone is talking about Swedish values, something which very few would have been prepared to even admit to their existence a year or so ago. The begging discussion has become more topical. There's been a mention of banning it, and the defense military debates are gradually climbing back onto the political agenda, the ladder. The darker colours are the ones characterising 2016 generally, with long waiting times in the healthcare sector still growing, a number of elderly people in danger of becoming poor, not enough care places in hospitals. Women have been flown to Finland for neonatal care when they give birth, for example. Other areas see cutbacks. The number of the rate of crime which is properly investigated and sanctioned. Continued immigration has increased. Insecurity and uncertainty growing. We saw the report that was published yesterday. We've seen an increase there as well. Major problems, Mr. Speaker. High unemployment remains the case regardless of what the Prime Minister tells us from up here, in particular for those who are of another origin than from this country. The flagship for job creation mentioned by the Prime Minister in the election campaign, they have failed completely. Traineeships, extra positions and various contracts that he referred to. It's all a failure. The integration policy is a complete failure, and this obviously impacts the labour market and society as a whole, needless to say, because integration is so much more than just a job and employment. And for every day that goes by without our government understanding this fully is unfortunately a day lost. The current government, Mr. Speaker, does not possess any capability whatsoever of keeping this country together. Welfare, to put it mildly, is under great pressure. Our defence, our armed forces are lacking the ability to respond to the changed security situation in our part of the world. And this debate is now held in a day and age where we, in political terms, are faced with difficult challenges, as it's called. For every day that goes by, I'm more and more troubled by the current government's complete inability and their resistance to reality. It characterises the analyses and the politics proposed by the government. We need new people at the reins who can deal with the reality based on what's actually needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next speaker is Gustav Fridolin from the Green Party.
Herr talman, jag tror på
Mr. Speaker, I believe in Sweden. I think this is a Sweden. We take on huge challenges when we also make something new of it. As 2017 will show us the principles where you can build a strong society. Let me propose three approaches. One is your efforts at school that determines your future, not the home that you grow up in. We need the fact that the PISA results are improving, etc. We see that things are going in the right direction. However, children's grades are more and more dependent on the size of the wallets of their parents. This is the situation. Look at the business leaders and entrepreneurs and everybody who built Sweden. They came from all walks of life. But one thing they all have in common is that they had a good education. 15 years ago, Sweden still had one of the most equal school systems in the world. Today, we need to go back to that again because we can't afford to waste talent in this way. Now, these inequalities in school are not in a vacuum because we see the inequalities in society everywhere, the huge gaps. And for these children from more difficult homes, it's more difficult for them to learn at school. For example, we need, for example, to ensure that children who need glasses should have glasses, irrespective of the wallets of the parents. And that's something that the previous government didn't understand. With the financial crisis, gaps increased. Instead of helping the schools and support schools, we decreased taxes instead. And also pupils had less time with their teachers. And of course, this had a huge impact on those who need schools most. And we can really see who paid for the crisis in this. And we are not cutting back anymore, the government. We are investing in schools. We're investing in what is most important for the weakest pupils, school libraries, school nurses, teacher guarantees, etc. This is good for all children, but it's most important for those children who need their schools the most. Second approach is that building a society, we need lots of people to be on board. However, there are no shortcuts in all of this. Some people say that the only labour market that is open was to young people was criminals' side. Then the society has to go in the other direction. Wherever, regardless where children grow up, you need to be able to get a job and not be discriminated against. Get rid of segregation. The creativity of these young guys needs to be used in a workplace, not in a crime scene. And there we can really attack crime and also the reasons behind crime. This goes hands in hand. We have professional criminals who get young people to join their gangs. We need to attack those, and we need to also find these young people before they start committing crime. These young people who commit crimes, we need to get at them at an early stage. And for example, an electronic tag on them, for example, is one way of dealing with these youngsters. The third approach, we need to be able to lead good lives without destroying it for those who come after us. We need to household with scarce resources, but we haven't done that. We've lived as if we've had lots of planets to live off. And if we continue in this way, we need 2 further planets to sustain us. In 2016 was the hottest year ever. And we have all these ceilings that we promised each other and our children in Paris that we wouldn't exceed them. Well, we've done that. And it's serious. Economics, technology, politics must together ensure that we have a society where we don't head in that direction. We need a fossil-free environment. Climate policy is therefore the core of economic policy. Environmental investments, taxes which make it more expensive to pollute but cheaper to set up smart startups, for example, reparation, green cities, renewables, solar cells, biogas, trains, bicycles. We're at the head of all of this. We're at the forefront. Mr. Speaker, this is a policy against crime, against gaps, and against the climate change. Things that concern us all and worry us all, because without action, then we are that will have a negative impact. But political action takes us forward, and our task as politicians is to attack the problems that we face, show that there's a better society out there, better future to long for. Thank you.
Tack.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Annie Lööf from the Centre Party. The floor is yours. Mr. Speaker, we've just left 2016 behind us. This was a year full of different events that we will remember for a long time. A lot of darkness, a lot of concern, a lot of sense of insecurity. Istanbul, Nizza, Baghdad, Berlin, crime in Malmö, Ronneby, Gothenburg, but also the town of Husby, where we have seen protests against crime and stores being closed. And we see people still fleeing for their lives, and we have a lot of insecurity in the world and also here at home amongst us. And here it's about a sense of insecurity about the jobs and the differences between the regions, people being unemployed. We have a crisis within the police force. We have the concern that you may lose your job, insecurity in rural areas, people working in care professions being attacked, and police officers working under difficult circumstances. It's about welfare, schools, primary health care centres, home for the elderly being threatened to be closed. We have assistant nurses, teachers who risk losing their jobs, and the same thing goes for students and pupils. We have the accessibility to care, that is another concern, that you actually can get care when you need it. We have waiting times that get longer and longer. We also have insecurity about the world around us, and we have the US intelligence service and what they've said, and this has an impact on us as well. It's not enough to have a government that refuses to listen to these warnings, these alarms that are being sounded when it comes to security policy, and that is what what the Prime Minister is doing. He's dismissing these threats. And what we need is someone who takes responsibility. We need resolute measures, action that is being taken. And Mr. Speaker, this is the world around us. The insecurity is there, and we need to do something about it. We have to do something about it. 2016 was a dark year, but we'll see more light in this year ahead of us. We do have 1 million people risking exclusion, and this is something that we have talked about for a long time in the Centre Party, people feeling insecurity, and this is something that we need to take seriously. People feel insecure if they risk losing their jobs. We also have parts of Sweden where there is no job to be had, and we have this difference between rural areas and cities, places where job opportunities never came back. We have exclusion, we have marginalization. It's about the corporate climate not being good enough, that it's difficult to get into the labor market in cities and in rural areas alike. Thresholds that are so high that it's difficult with integration. It is possible to turn this trend, however. We can create more jobs across the country, but we need to take decisive steps. We need to reform the labor market. The corporate climate has to be improved. We need to move away from old-fashioned social democratic policies that's just about taxes, emptying the wallets of people. We need to renew this policy. We need to look at digitization, globalization, and we need to be able to compete in this global market. We need to understand that all jobs are necessary. This is something that's necessary if we're to be successful with integration. We need jobs that require high skills and competences, but we also need more basic jobs. We want to make it easier for those who haven't been in the labour market to get a first job, to try it out. And we want to have more deductions for domestic services to help those who've just arrived to Sweden and to help those who are far removed from the labour market. We also need a better corporate climate when entrepreneurship, risk-taking, job creation is worthwhile. We're the only party who want to go back to the tax deductions for electricians and other similar occupations, so that these corporate companies can thrive and that we can create new jobs. So we want to continue working for a policy that creates jobs across the country. The feeling of insecurity, well, we can turn it around. We can do this. We can give everyone across the country a chance to get a job. We can take measures against violence, against crime, the feeling of insecurity that we see across the country. We can do something about this. We can have concrete reforms. We can change our values, our policy measures, so that we make a difference in people's everyday lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next, Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party, please.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, members, visitors, we've heard a very dim picture of the world, especially when we was in 2016 here today until now, and I share that rather dismal picture. Last year was a terrible year in many ways. A lot of racism, terror, violence, insecurity. But if we listen a little bit further into what their speeches, we hear the nuances, the differences. The government is talking about what's good in Sweden, because of course the government wants to say that the economy is strong, that more have a job to go to, that the school results perhaps have that trend has turned. But let's hope. The opposition is, of course, even more negative. That is the opposition's role sometimes, talking about things that are going badly and sort of a darker picture. And, of course, the darkest picture, the gloomiest picture is Jimmy Åkesson. He was so busy with this that there was not one political decision that or proposal for what's to be done in those 5 minutes came at all. But how can we describe reality? Well, I think both sides are true. I think things are going well. We've got more jobs. We are building more, which is very important. And school results have perhaps turned for the better, which is really good. And we've got more billionaires than ever, 178, and they are richer than ever. They have loads of money. So many people are pretty well off in Sweden, but there are large groups in Swedish society who feel that this is awful to have to listen to all these poor people who, for example, they open up their pension payments and they see that this month they won't have enough money. So what do I have to not do, as it were, this month, because otherwise I can't cope this month? And so things aren't going so well for them. Those who, for example, need a new home but can't afford to buy one, or all those who don't get enough hours work, as it were, to make a living. That's where the problem lies. These inequalities in Sweden, that I think is our biggest challenge. Because if you take action and deal with this, the only party that wants to do that is the Left Party. Because we see in the state budget, though all the allocations that attack these inequalities those suggestions come from my party. So the 10 billion, for example, that apply from 1st of January, and then we also have free medical service for those who are 85 plus. There are many different examples. You need access to medical care in a better way, etc. Lower taxes, higher taxes, and lower taxes for certain groups. We're also improving, for example, housing benefits for certain groups, and we also have other measures for young people. If, for example, if we're going to get at the high abortion figures, we also need to have free advice to give to young people. We need to also invest more in police, for example, for when it comes to transporters, and many different examples of what we are doing. We are making a difference in politics, but we need to do more. Together with the government, we're going to put forward proposals where we're trying to get rid of profits in the welfare companies. This makes Sweden a fairer place, and this is a better use of taxpayers' money. So are we in agreement then? Well, no, we're not, actually. We're not in agreement with the government. Gustav Fridolin and Stefan Löfven talking about really good things about equality from the rostrum here, which is great, which is good. But we have these 178 billionaires, and they are richer than ever, and they own twice as much as the state budget. That's the amount they have in their coffers. And so when we have a budget negotiations with the government and say, well, but can't they pay a couple of billion then, if they own 200,000 billions? So is it reasonable that there is no higher tax for them, inheritance tax, etc.? If you have loads of huge properties, shouldn't you pay higher property tax for those? Then the government says no. The government says no. And I believe that that's the crux of the problem. If we're going to resolve this for those who have problems with their pensions, who don't have good, secure jobs, who don't have homes, for example, we need to do something to create a more equal society where all can contribute. And there, the 178 billionaires, they also have to contribute. And I think that's the difference. Thank you.
And thank you. The next speaker will be Jan Björklund from the Liberal Party.
Herr talman,
Mr. Speaker, if schools are successful, then Sweden will be successful. But if schools fail, then the country will fail. The alliance government has an extensive school reform that has led to a change in school results, where the old policy has been replaced. That was done 10 years ago with the liberal knowledge policy. Yesterday we had an evaluation that was published about this most controversial school reform that we carried out with earlier grades, and this was something that other parties voted against. But yesterday we saw the outcome. 80% of the pupils in schools, they now say that they work harder because they're given grades. 80% also say that they can improve their grades by making an effort. Teachers feel that it's easier today to find those pupils who need extra help, and it's generally perceived that it's easier to improve results. So, Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, you were wrong about schools. You were wrong about grades and when to use them. And this doesn't mean, however, that we can just lean back and do nothing. Opposite is the case. The PISA survey shows us that we can turn the trend around, that we can carry out reforms to improve things. We need to do that. We need to have grades even earlier so that we get positive results earlier on. We need better order in schools, better discipline so that pupils can study, and we need also the possibility to look at how people and pupils behave in schools, and we need to look at what pupils are supposed to learn and themselves. We need to help teachers. We need to give them better training. And we want our schools to be the best. We want to be among the 10 best in PISA. And this is a big challenge. It's also a very ambitious one. And it's just one way to get there. We need to continue with reforms, helping knowledge. We cannot have this wishy-washy reform that we see today. Integration, Mr. Speaker, that's not a big challenge for the next few years. There is so much potential. We just have to give people a chance. And, Mr. Speaker, it's always better to have a job, even if it's a basic job, and even if your entry salary, your entry wages aren't that high. And that is not the situation today. Work with equality. Well, here we're giving new challenges as well with integration. Many women who come to Sweden, they live in honor cultures with oppression. And this is something we need to look at, and we need to make use of expulsion if we have crimes like that. Mr. Speaker, Russian military armament, it continues also in the Baltic Sea area. Sweden, over the next few years, will for the first time ever have less than 1% of GDP allocated to the defense budget. That is a consequence of the 2015 defense decision. Earlier, we had 2% allocated to GDP. 2% of GDP allocated to defense, and our fighter jets are now to be decommissioned because there is no money to operate them. That is what the government says, and these jets, they cost hundreds of millions to buy, and now they're going to be decommissioned. The Defense Commission of 2015, it's like a big black hole. We need to increase more funding to defense. We need to do that heavily and soon, but the government is doing nothing. Instead of more money, the government will just start another defense commission to look at the situation. We see more unrest around us, and that means that extremism and populism is growing, with simple messages promising easy answers to difficult societal challenges. And we see our values under threat today in the Western world. And we, the Liberal Party, we feel that we have an even more important task ahead of us than ever before. We want more freedom for the individuals. Schools, integration and defense, these are three areas in society where we need to ensure that everyone feels safe and that people can feel free and safe. And that is what we want to focus on. We need less populism and more liberalism in Swedish policy action, and we need a new government.
Tack.
Thank you. Next speaker, Andreas Carlson from the Christian Democrats. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few days into the new year now, and the new year is a time when you reflect on what the year gone by and gaze into the future. 2016 in many ways was a year of uncertainty, but that was also what we saw in the first few days of 2017 with the terrorist attack against a nightclub in Istanbul, and also a terrorist attack on an open forum in Square in Jerusalem. We need to condemn every single terrorist attack with the hope of a safer, more secure Sweden and a world around us. We need more action. We need more to face up to the challenges we witness around us. We're very concerned in the Christian Democratic Party when it comes to all these threats. No, or are we feeling any safer after we saw the presentation by the government this weekend of the National Defence Strategy? It has no concrete content to tell us how Sweden is going to face up to these challenges. It's simply not good enough, Mr. Speaker. The 2015 defence decision needs to be updated and revised. We welcome the resumption of the Defence Commission's work. We need to get underway instantly, and the Swedish defence capability needs to be strengthened in the short term. This is a matter of urgency, not least when it comes to the psychological defence. We would like to also introduce a cyber security agency, and we've made proposals for a long time to take drastic, more extensive measures to combat terrorism. We need to take Sweden's security and put it at the forefront of our agenda. A threat domestically or internationally, insecurity must be combated, Mr. Speaker, but also when it comes to crime committed closer to people's everyday lives. I was unlucky last year. These words aren't mine. That was spoken by Åke, 92 years of age, who in the Expressen edition of last Friday explained how last year he was mugged outside his home, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He enjoys going for a walk with the support of his walking equipment, and he was robbed of his belongings, of his possessions, just outside his home, only very recently. It's hard not to feel very concerned when you hear this. Cowardly muggers who steal people's belongings. This is a worry that is spreading. Many elderly people are afraid to go outside. They're won't go and visit friends, or family, go and do their shopping. Åke is only one example of the type of problem, the type of crime that the police are unable to focus on due to lack of resources. That can't be permitted to continue. Marianne, at the age of 79, is another one of the victims. In the newspaper, she explained how she was assaulted brutally, having asked a few adolescents not to fire fireworks against her home. This has to have consequences for the perpetrators, and we need completely different resources than what's available today. No more dismantling of resources. Mr. Speaker, this is why we Christian Democrats have proposed 2,600 new employees in the police administration and better terms and conditions for the police officers working in our streets and towns. They need to focus on their core tasks. We heard someone say on Swedish television from the police saying that they could be 10 more or 10 times more. And still it would be difficult to combat the drug problems in some of the suburbs characterized by unrest. This is not a way to try and deter. This is reality. This is real life. But it's also about the economy and about care services to feel safe and secure. People who've built this country, who've made it a strong, a good place to be, they shouldn't feel worried that they won't get the care services they need or that the money won't be enough for them to buy the very basics in life. We want to implement 3 major reforms for the elderly. We want a guarantee for couples to live together. If they've lived together throughout their entire lives, they must be given the right to do so even when health is failing them. We want care service teams introduced, helping with additional tasks in the care sector so that auxiliary nurses and nurses can focus on their main tasks. And we want teams bringing people home, helping them to get established and organised after having spent some time in a hospital environment. And we want to close the tax gap between those who are retired and those who are working professionally. It's not just about time and money, it's about security, social justice, and these are issues which are very important to us. We want to turn this around for the elderly as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And now we have a free rate of rejoinders, and the next speaker will be Stefan Löfven. Mr. Speaker, we've heard the opposition parties talk about the challenges that Sweden are facing: unemployment, segregation, welfare, and we all agree about the challenges. We have had too many years here where we have allowed gaps to increase, and the right-wing alliance at that time didn't do anything. Instead, we saw those gaps increasing when they were in government we saw tax deductions with some 140 billion. What we see across the world today with Brexit, with the right-wing populism growing in Europe, the election results in the US, well, all of this should make us wake up. This should be like a cold shower for the right-wing politicians who feel that tax deductions and reductions in welfare is the way ahead. Real wages haven't gone up in many countries, which means that welfare is not good enough, and people feel that the system has failed them. That is what we see in the world around us, and this would people feel that they have been abandoned. We've seen that in Sweden as well, but thanks to the Swedish model, we have been able to ensure that we have had real wages going up considerably, and we have a stronger welfare system than many other countries. So the answer to the Swedish challenges cannot be to do away with the Swedish model. It's the opposite that's the case. We should evolve and develop the Swedish model, but the other parties doesn't seem to have understood this. They wanted to see more tax deductions, they want to see reductions in welfare systems, and they want to lower wages for ordinary people. They wanted to spend less on schools. And why do you focus on doing away with the Swedish model, with the strong welfare system, the equality? This is what has built Sweden and our successes. Why?
Thank you. A request for a joiner from Anna Kinberg Batra, Jimmy Åkesson, Annie Lööf, Andreas Karlsson, etc. Anna Kinberg Batra for the first rejoinder. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Insecurity on the rise in Sweden. 1 woman out of 3 has concerns for her safety, is worried to go out alone at night. The confidence and trust in our police services is increasing. Do you have confidence in the top leadership?
Prime Minister, well, thank you. It is correct that many people feel insecure, and that is not the way it should be. People should be able to feel secure in our society, and we should be hard on crime and the reasons for crime. That is the basic strategy, and that is why we're adding more resources to the police. We're also reorganizing the police, and the two of us, we actually agreed. We have a broad agreement on reorganizing the police force, but we also need more resources. We need to ensure that we have higher penalties on many crimes. We've started that, and we're going to continue. I've already talked about that, and the reorganization, of course, it has to show results, and we have the ambition that we should have more police officers closer to people. And I do feel confident in this manager, and I do think that we'll be able to produce results.
Anna Kinberg Batra, the reason why we're investing 10 times more than the government in our budget to strengthen the police organisation is that we need more police officers, need to be able to get better pay and have the preconditions needed to do their job to improve the situation in the country as a whole. I hear the worry, the concern. I take it seriously. 1 woman in 3 afraid to go out alone at night. So I ask you once again, where lies the responsibility to get the police to do their job? It is with the National Police Commissioner, surely a government agency under the auspices of the government, and you are responsible as Prime Minister. If I had your job and you asked me if I was satisfied with the current situation, with the public trust in the police going down, I would say no to that question. I wouldn't be satisfied.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not surprised that Anna Kinberg Batra says that she would answer no. We are actually increasing the resources for the police, but it's a fact that there is no warehouse we can go get police officers. We need to train them first, and we are adding resources to the police services. We're going to look at crimes and penalties for these, and we need to produce results. And that is what the Commissioner is tasked to do, to ensure that the police services will be in such a situation that they can be closer to the people, that they can bring about more sense of security. But it's a big reorganization, and I think we agree on that. It's one of our biggest agencies, but the job has to be done, of course.
Tack. Nästa replik har begärt av...
Thank you. Jimmy Åkesson has requested the next rejoinder from the Sweden Democrats. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister. The Prime Minister presented in his opening remarks a view of 2016 as that of unrest and turbulence. I'm inclined to agree. We see continued division, segregation, insecurity on the rise, and a worrying situation in terms of the security. Defence and security policy have been highly topical over the past week, naturally, and several voices have been heard to request more money to the armed forces and our defence. I read an article in a paper the other day where the Prime Minister referred to this as playing bingo with monetary allocations, and he managed to just wave off a matter which is highly important, a whole debate which is very relevant to our safety and our security. Does the Prime Minister not understand that this is about our security and our... does he not understand that it costs money?
Prime Minister, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We took over after a government who felt that defence was a special interest. We feel that it's of national interest, and you made reductions. We increased funding to defence. We have started the compulsory military service again. You removed it. We're looking at the defence, and we need to defend the Swedish borders, and we have started this work, and we're working broadly, and I think this is something that's necessary. We're actually adding more resources to the Swedish defence, and we need to do that because we need to increase our defence capability. But to hear one amount one day, a second amount day 2, third amount day 3, and then the one who proposed it says, well, I'll go with something else. This is not the way it works. We need to discuss how to increase our defence capability, military defence, civil defence, total defence, and that is what we are aiming to do.
Tack.
Thank you. Jimmy Åkesson, please. I'm not going to say that I'm dumbfounded. I'm not short of words, but I just believe I heard the Prime Minister saying that he's going to raise the grants for the defence. Whether it's a game of bingo or not, I don't know. But Stefan Löfven is proudly claiming that he's increased the funding, there's broad agreement, but the armed forces are saying that they're lacking billions and billions in order to even accomplish and achieve the objectives in the current decision. As much as 30 billion to reach the objective, so money is lacking already. So the question now is whether Stefan Löfven has gained this realization this week, possibly, or why was there no money in the budget we adopted, that was adopted very recently, which will enable the armed forces to at least achieve the targets that have already been adopted by this parliament.
Statsminister.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Well, we now heard a fourth figure being mentioned. And we cannot continue like this, talking about X billions and then have different numbers, 3-4 different numbers that are being tossed around. That is not how to strengthen the Swedish defence. We need to think about what to do to improve our defence capability in addition to what is already being done. Sometimes you might believe that we're not doing anything, but we're working with more people. We're working with military presence. For example, we're now sending a military presence to the island of Gotland, and we need to discuss more specifically what needs to be done. We can't just toss figures around in the air and then just try to work with all 4 of them. We need to ensure that we're resource efficient also when it comes to defence and our defence capability, and we should discuss more concretely what to do with the funding.
Tack.
Thank you. And Annie Lööf has requested the next rejoinder for the Centre Party. Mr. Speaker, Stefan Löfven needs to stop the talk and start taking responsibility. You heard the expression of playing bingo with the grants and allocations, but this is a party leaders debate. Stefan Löfven is the leader of the Social Democratic Party, and it is our job to ask what the Social Democratic Party politics consist of. How much are you planning to and proposing to add to the defence budget? This is a very serious time and age. We're in a difficult situation in terms of security policy. There are many alarm bells going off in terms of the security situation. The new security strategy presented is only an outline, an account of the threats. We need action as well. We've presented a proposal earlier this autumn, during the autumn, that we need to get to the average at Nordic level at least in terms of our funding. Is the Prime Minister of the opinion that it's reasonable or unreasonable for Sweden to reach the Nordic average when it comes to defence funding?
And thank you, Prime Minister. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've just talked about this. We hear figures left and right, and they're all different. And the Centre Party, you're proposing one amount, and then the following day you say, no, we'll go with the Moderate Party. But I think the government should first make an inventory of our security situation, you say, and then you want to start with an amount and then do that inventory, and that's not right. We have an agreement about the defence, and we should stick to that agreement, and we need to work on that basis and discuss how to increase our defence capability, but we should start with the proper things. We have strengthened the defence when it comes to submarines, coastal defence, a presence in the island of Gotland, for example, and we're going to continue increasing defence capabilities. And it's not just about a number, it's about the defence capability. It's the Swedish defence that it's all about.
Thank you. Annie Lööf. Mr. Speaker, the Swedish defence and security policies are based on responsibility, capability of action, and consensus, broadly achieving consensus. And it shouldn't be the case that only the social democratic policy should prevail. It's based on compromises, and that's why it's important to know where you're coming from in the Social Democratic Party. The development in Russia has me gravely concerned, and Public Defense Institute published information just before Christmas to suggest that that is in case the matter of fake news and that type of action has increased. The alliance parties have realised this fully. The question is whether the Social Democratic Party is taking this seriously enough. We've proposed from the Centre Party to do an inventory of the situation in the short term, so that in the longer term we can raise the funding to the Nordic average. At least you can check the numbers. And I ask once again if the Prime Minister feels that it is reasonable that Sweden can reach the Nordic average, at least in the longer term, when it comes to our funding.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to Nordic average and her percentage of GDP, well, it might be interesting to compare, but this is not everything. One country could have a better GDP growth than another country, and then compared to another country, because you do not spend the same percentage of GDP, then one could argue that the defence capability is not as good. I'm talking about concrete differences, personnel, materials, infrastructure, the organisation, and it's all quite clear. We have an agreement, we have a broad agreement, and we have agreed that we're going to continue to strengthen our total defence. It's based on a non-alignment, and we need to increase our military capability, our defence capability. And I'm happy to hear that Annie Lööf mentions this agreement, and we should stick to the agreement for Sweden, for our defence capabilities. We are prepared to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party has the next rejoinder. Please go ahead. Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, a quote: gender equality makes as much financial sense, and freedom is best built in equal societies. That's your quote from something you said on the 1st of May, and I agree with every single word of it. Equality is important, but that's not exactly the situation in Sweden. Many people can't make ends meet on their pensions. They're not getting compensation from the social security system. At the other end, the wealthiest people are wealthier than ever. 178 billionaires, 26% wage increases amongst the wealthiest of the Swedish directors. The billionaires own more than twice the amount of the Swedish public budget. Sweden is a tax haven, no tax on wealth or the most expensive properties or the largest inheritances. As long as that is the case, they'll continue to speed ahead and the gaps will grow. Why aren't you prepared to make the billionaires contribute more to our general welfare?
Prime Minister, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, the capital gains tax had huge problems with it because it was more or less voluntary, actually, and that type of taxation is really not possible. Now, what we're doing is we're increasing equalities, and we've done it together with you. And Jonas Sjöstedt, you've put in the good parts to all our policy, as you say, but in fact we have agreed on the whole budget. And then I think Jonas Sjöstedt, then you could also agree with us that when we now sum up the budget, where we've gone from the alliance budget, where most went to those who had most, to a budget where most of it goes to those who have the least. Let's continue along those lines. Our budgets give more to women than to men. So let's continue on that route and ensure that we gradually even out these inequalities. And the most important thing is that people have a job to go to. That's the first thing you need to do. We need to create welfare and then distribute accordingly.
Tack. Tack. Jonas Sjöstedt.
Thank you, Jonas Sjöstedt. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is correct that the distribution within the budget means that low wage earners and women are the winners. I'm proud of that fact. I've contributed to it, but it doesn't improve equality, however. There's a danger that in spite of these budget reforms, inequalities and gaps are growing and the wealthiest are pulling ahead. And unfortunately, I believe that's what's happening right now. It's going to be difficult to cope with and ensure both jobs and the welfare if our society becomes as unequal as it is on the path towards becoming. So the wealthiest must contribute more to the common good. You can have a different type of capital gains or wealth tax than what you used to have. Why couldn't you pay a single krona tax on an inheritance of several billions? And why should the property fees be the same for a small semi-detached house and some of the most expensive villas? It's just not fair, and we are not in agreement, I believe, Mr. Löfven.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now I think that we can agree on the fact that we need to review the tax system. I mean, the whole in its entirety. That's sort of something much bigger than just doing one thing here and one thing there. I think in that case it's something much larger. But what we need to do is we need to improve equality in Sweden, and we are doing that. And we're also looking at the Gini coefficient, where we have in fact seen that this has been dramatically increasing, that fewer people own a lot more. And this is something that we are really doing our utmost to do something about. But we need jobs. More people need jobs. Jobs is the number one priority. That's how we create welfare. If you look at equality and this coefficient, for example, if you add welfare to that, something happens to equality, which is why we need to continue to ensure that people have jobs to go to, create welfare, distribute welfare to help people who need it most. Thank you.
Thank you. Next rejoinder requested by Jan Björklund from the Liberal Party. Please. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has an not entirely honest way of describing the defence policies. He's criticising the alliance government of having irresponsible defence policies. That's a matter for discussion. But he forgot to mention that the Social Democrats wanted to make cutbacks during the years of the alliance government to the tune of 5 billion from the defence budget. And that's a fairly important factor, because if it had happened, the condition right now would have been even worse. And you voted against the Signalling Act. You wanted the sector to have older equipment rather than more modern phone equipment, for example. It's worth considering. If we'd had social democratic policies during those years, we would have been less well prepared in our capabilities today. But here's my question. In which way is the Swedish capability for defence improved by you doing away with 100 modern fighter jets?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to defence allocation, in 2014, we in fact proposed an increase of 1 billion. That's when you were in power. You said no to that. That was 2014. You were part of a government, Jan Björklund, that said that the defence, that is a special interest. We need to reduce it, and you were so sure that we need to. The best thing that we can do is to go along that route. But now you're just as sure that we need to go in the other direction. But I mean, you're not credible, really. First, what would happen if the officer would do this? First, you go, would lead the troops in one direction. Oh no, hang on a minute, let's go in the other direction. I hope you didn't do that when you were a major in the army. We need a new defence policy. We need to get it. I mean, because sometimes, Jan Björklund, you talk about trying to find a solution. I think you really need to make an effort to really have a good discussion and to be part of the negotiations. Thank you.
Tack, Jan.
Thank you. Jan Björklund. Mr. Speaker, the defence of Gotland was dismantled. The Army, the Air Force, more or less done away with the defence decisions. Many mistakes have been made over the year, and the alliance decision from 2009 should have been much stronger. There's no question about that in hindsight, but we're here and now. And here's my question. 100 fighter jets. The last one was delivered from production 2 years ago from Linköping, and now it's time to dismantle them entirely because you feel you don't have the money to hire pilots, to operate and manage them, to have the facilities needed. 100 million invested by the taxpayers in these fighter jets, and you're going from 100 to 60 fighter jets. You said that you're strengthening air defence. How do you strengthen it if you scrap 100 modern fighter jets?
Tack, statsminister.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me just remind Jan Björklund again who has pursued what policy. Now, this restructuring of the Swedish Air Force, that started during your time in power. And when JAS agreement CD was going to change to E, the CD fighter jets aren't disappearing tomorrow or next year. They're going to be used until the mid-2020s when the E version has been introduced gradually. So what you're saying there is erroneous in two ways. You said, firstly, your government, as if you weren't involved in it. But yes, you were. You were in agreement with this. And it's also erroneous to say that we are now just getting rid of these fighter jets. That's not the matter at all. No, they will be the sort of they will be central to our Air Force, and you know that. You're just trying to make a point, and it's just a simple point that you're making. I really wish that we could meet in a factual discussion and negotiation on defence. That's my hope, at least.
Thank you. Andreas Karlsson from the Christian Democrats. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned Åke, 92 years of age, in my main address. Åke, who in the Friday edition of the Expressen newspaper explained how he was mugged not once, not twice, but on 3 occasions last year. It's difficult to forget, to stop thinking about what these cowardly perpetrators put him through. But it's only one of many examples of everyday crime, which not least our elderly population is exposed to in rural areas where it's very far from any police officer. And there's no resources nor money available to give any sort of priority to this type of crime. There's a crisis in the Swedish police, but Stefan Löfven refuses to take that word in his mouth. Are you prepared to admit that there's a crisis in the Swedish police administration? And I also ask you, Stefan Löfven, what are your proposals for measures to turn this around for the future, for Åke and for many others?
Prime Minister, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, even in this area, I would say that it's not the labels that are important here. You can say the thing is that the Swedish police force has a problem with a new organisation to getting it to work, so we have more police officers working properly. Yes, but don't say that they're not good enough for anything, because that's wrong. I've been to many police stations, I've spoken to many police officers, and they do a fantastic job. And one thing that I've understood in that contact that I've had with them is they say, ensure that the reorganisation is completed because it is right to do it that way. And then there are things that need to be done within this reorganisation. But how are we going to do that? Well, more resources, which is why we are going to allocate more resources. The police organisation has received more resources and they'll be giving more resources. But we haven't got sort of... What we need to educate or to train more police officers, etc. And this is what that's the approach we're taking. Thank you.
Andreas Karlsson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is wishy-washy by the Prime Minister to say that I said that the police are up to no good, that they're not doing their job well enough. I've been out meeting many of them as well. I've come across so many people who are working extremely ardently, but many also choose to leave because of poor, deteriorating working conditions and pay. We've seen this only recently as well. The difference between our policies and your proposals is that your investments are only coming after the next general elections. You may talk all you want about major investments, but there's an underfunding of the police force in this country. We need to really take active measures. We can talk about stricter penalties, but we need to talk about how we can get more active police officers out in active duty and combat crime, not just everyday crime, but homicide, abuse and other types of very serious crime, which is also seeing downgrading in the list of priorities.
You're right, which is why we're allocating more resources to the police, which is why we're doing it. And they need more resources. We need to complete the reorganisation that we agreed on and that the police themselves say this needs to be fulfilled and completed. But once again, Andreas Karlsson, if you have a store of fully trained police officers somewhere, well, great, but there is no such store. We need to train more gradually. And if Andreas Karlsson and the Christian Democrats believe that the problems that you're painting up here are resolved best with a reduction in taxes, you're wrong. Because all problems that are being painted up here by the opposition, including the Christian Democrats, they are resolved by more tax revenue. We need to work more together in our country. We don't need to see tax cuts and cutbacks altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. The rejoinders to the address from the Prime Minister is concluded. We move on to Anna Kinberg Batra for the Moderate Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Work means a sense of belonging, community, the power to shape your own life and your future. More men and women finding a job is decisive if we're going to keep this country together. Thus spoke the newly appointed Prime Minister Stefan Löfven in his declaration of government in 2014, and allow me, Mr. Speaker, to agree with him for once today. However, how did things fare out? Well, the split in the labour market is ever growing. According to the Swedish labour market or employment services in their report in December of last year, many groups find it very difficult to find any jobs, in particular young people who are lacking in education or low qualifications, those born abroad. We have 1 million people living on grants and benefits rather than being able to make a living for themselves and have a job. We can now see that the lack of proper employment policy is hitting very hard against those who have never had a job or do not have a job to go to. Stefan Löfven promised to resolve this with 85,000 trainee jobs, new additional positions and other contracts. And when the Aftonbladet newspaper did the maths, it was 4,019 in total as a result. The new type of jobs proposed previously will be introduced, where about 500 people will be asked to sort and organize documentation in various government agencies, for example, sorting papers, when we could do with 150,000 easier low qualified or low skilled jobs to cope with integration. That's no simple task. It takes a plan for a stronger Sweden where it's easier and less expensive to employ people. It pays to work, to move from benefit into the labour market, and many more. And low-skilled jobs can increase. More jobs, more Swedish jobs, more people who can get their first job. We want to put the entire population to work.
Tack.
Thank you. Rejoinders have been requested by Stefan Löfven, Jimmy Åkesson, Gustav Fridolin and Jonas Sjöstedt. First, the Prime Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, I would just like to say to Anna Kinberg Batra, read the unemployment figures. We see that so many more have a job to go to, and measures are in place to help people to go from unemployment to employment, and things have improved, which is a good policy to pursue. And then you're talking about the unemployment benefit system as well. That's right. But the other groups, reducing unemployment benefit for those who have lived and worked in Sweden, we're saying that the newly arrived people should receive twice as much. At the same time, they should be working without having an impact on the levels. Can you explain to me how this all hangs together? Why should new refugees or new people who've just arrived be treated differently to other unemployed people?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few hours into the debate, it's becoming very clear what Stefan Löfven is aiming at, to try and describe the big problems in society as smaller problems. We've 1 million people on benefits rather than working, and as I take this seriously, even if you don't. I'm not happy enough to just look at employment statistics for the most privileged in the labour market. I focus rather on the groups who've never had their first job yet, who are not privileged in the labour market, who've never had the privilege of working to pay for their own existence. This has to be resolved. That's our opinion, and that's why we in the Moderate Party are proposing very drastic measures to move from benefit into work, where this pays, where you can ask more of the people on benefits, that it should be possible to make a living on your first job. Otherwise, we can't keep this country together. Rather than talking about that and taking that situation seriously, Stefan Löfven is doing what the so-called Workers' Party are doing better than anyone else, talking about benefits. It's the jobs that matter. Thank you.
Statsministern.
Prime Minister. Well, Mrs. Speaker, let me put the question again. Why should people who've just arrived have twice the amount to benefits, as it were, compared to other unemployed people? Some should have a reduced level as well compared to these newly arrived people. So what are you talking about here? When you were the group leader for the Moderate Party here in the Parliament, for 8 years we had in fact a moderate-led government. Unemployment increased, long-term unemployment increased, youth unemployment increased, the number of people on social benefits increased, the number of people or areas that were sort of marginalised have increased. This is what we've changed today. We're not far from satisfied, but the 120,000 people, more people, have a job, which I'm very happy about. We need to ensure that all people who can work should also work. We've changed the tide. We need to stick to the root. It's not tax cuts, cutbacks, etc. that do this. It's jobs and people who make the difference.
Tack. Anna Kinberg Batra.
Thank you, Anna Kinberg Batra. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A brief lesson of history, first of all. When we unfortunately lost the election in 2014, there were more people who were born in another country who had a job to go to, more than ever before. I'm proud of that, but it's far from enough after the refugee crisis over the past while, and so many newcomers who've not yet been able to establish themselves in Sweden and in the labour market. There's a danger of marginalisation for many, many new arrivals who've not been able to establish themselves. And Stefan Löfven is focusing on benefits, as always. But let me put it to you this way. It's much better not to be reliant on benefits at all, but to be able to make a living from a job. That's why we need 150,000 low-qualified, low-skilled jobs, and you're calling them something completely different, trying to make a joke of it. But Sweden needs to be able to create these new jobs to break the marginalisation trend. This is our major challenge, and you're choosing to close your eyes on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next rejoinder, Jimmy Åkesson from the Sweden Democrats, please. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, I and Anna Kinberg Batra have in our speeches, in fact, says about this sense of loss of sense of security and how it's increasing, in fact, this sense of insecurity in society, which is very important. And what we heard just the other day is that there are very few foreign citizens in Sweden who are deported after having committed serious crimes. They're not even sentenced to it. Only about 20% of those foreign citizens who are sentenced to a prison sentence are also sentenced to deportation. 9 out of 10 of those who commit these violent crimes, in fact, stay in the country. And even if they are deported from the country, they are sort of released. 3 out of 4 are released after they have been in prison. And so my question to Anna Kinberg Batra, who says that she has changed her view when it comes to migration policy, etc., are you planning to do anything about this?
Anna Kinberg Batra. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want Sweden to be safe for everyone, all men, all women, everyone. And then we have major problems in these areas where the criminal gangs have taken over. We need to stop that criminality. It doesn't matter who commits a crime or why. It's criminality that has to be stopped. We need police presence. We need proper sentencing when we have violent crimes. And there is a possibility today already, if you're not a Swedish citizen and if you're sentenced, then you can be expelled from the country, and that should be used to a greater extent, and it should also be addressed more often by prosecutors. But what's important to me is not who commits the crime or from where that person comes, but the fact that all of Sweden should be safe, and therefore the police needs to be able to do its job.
Jimmy Åkesson. Yes, Mr. Speaker. Well, I don't know whether that was an answer to my question, which was a fairly, concrete question. I agree with you that I think we can all agree on that Sweden, the entire country, should be safe. But perhaps it's the route to that aim that we can't agree on. But what about expelling these serious criminals that are not Swedish citizens and they commit serious crimes here in Sweden? That's not really happening today. So, Anna Kinberg Batra, are you prepared to, together with me, to ensure that we see this to a greater extent? And the fact that we don't want to see 3 to 4 who are sentenced to deportation, they just disappear. No one knows where they are. That is something that we can, in a way which can increase this and improve the sense of security around the country. So, Anna Kinberg Batra, do you want to do something about this or not? I think we can have a majority in favour of this if we cooperate.
Tack. Anna Kinberg.
And thank you, Anna Kinberg Batra. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the way it works in this chamber is that we make decisions and legislation. And I know that previously, last fall, we had a proposal presented about this. We have moderate party proposals. We've had them for a long time. And we know that we have this possibility in Swedish law already. You can expel someone if that person is not a Swedish citizen and is sentenced for a violent crime, and that person can be expelled. We have that possibility today, and it can be and it should be used on serious crime. And I'm going to vote for that in this chamber, and I think everyone should do the same.
Next rejoined has been requested by Gustav Fridolin from the Green Party. Floor is yours. Thank you. Mr. Speaker. That is what Anna Kinberg Batra had to say about the climate in her speech. Now, and because you forgot this issue in your Christmas speech, in your summer speech, in your speech to the Moderate Party conference and the 5-party leader debates that you have participated in thus far, let me just give her one last chance. Climate change are for real. Climate change is for real. But the Paris Agreement is very clear. All countries, even Sweden, is responsible to reduce its emissions. You can't blame anybody else. So, the Moderate Party, what do you want to do to reduce Swedish emissions?
Thank you. I'm Anna Kinberg Batra. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, you as well. And perhaps you who should go back and read the previous speeches, articles in newspapers, etc., and look at what has been said in other debates when we have had more time than we have today. I'm happy about the Paris Agreement having been concluded, but with all the insecurity and uncertainty around us, that is not enough, and that is why I've addressed the issue of security, safety, defence, why we need to strengthen the defence and why we need to ensure that we have an economy that will enable us to have functioning transports, industrial production, companies. We, the alliance government, we turned Sweden into the country that has the highest proportion of renewables in Europe, and we invested the most in renewables, and that is good. But, Gustav Fridolin, that also takes that you have good order in state finances, that you have growth, so that we can keep nuclear power instead of putting it in early retirement, which was close to happening.
Tack. Gustav Fridolin.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's true that the moderate party were, in fact, be able to sort of say that, well, the market resources will see that we have 100% renewables. It was a good agreement. The problem, though, Lane, that the market principles, they don't believe in environment policies. You want to reduce carbon dioxide tax, for example, which is the most important way to have a positive impact on the environment. You want to say no to air traffic paying for its pollution. You say no for it to cost to be a pollutant. That's not believing in the market. That is just not bothering about the environment. And then you say we had to resolve it elsewhere. But and the EU board, for example, with the Sweden Democrats, you are preventing the government from pursuing a more stringent policy, and also helping those who are affected by climate change. So one last chance. What does the moderate party want to do to reduce Swedish emissions? I mean, come on, some kind of answer should be there.
Tack, herr talman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one can go to work in their car in the morning if it's too expensive, if you can't afford using your card. And this means that jobs, our economy, we're dependent on cars and trucks. And if there are those who want to have fossil fuels, but if we are to conduct a change, then we need to do something properly. You want to close nuclear power plants, and how would that help the climate? That would make it more difficult to transfer to electric cars. But it's also interesting to hear you talking about market policies and financial growth. Let me add to this what we have from the Green Party Congress about a year ago, where they distanced themselves from financial growth. They said that they wanted another financial system, but that way you cannot manage jobs and you cannot manage the climate either.
Thank you. Next rejoinder has been requested by Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party. Floor is yours. Mr. Speaker, Anna Kinberg Batra. In 9 days, Donald Trump will become the President of the United States. We don't really know what to expect, but we do know that this is a person who has reactionary views, lack of taking action, which is a rather difficult situation. He's racist and misogynist. Not interested in the climate, not very good when it comes to impulse control. He's favourable vis-a-vis Putin. Putin may, of course, what's the catch? We don't know there. And he will soon become the supreme commander and the most powerful man in NATO. The United States has most nuclear weapons, etc. He will be controlling NATO policy in the future. He's the most important person there. And you want to become a member of NATO just when Donald Trump is going to take over. Do you feel safe with him as president?
Anna Kinberg Batra, varsågod.
Thank you, Anna Kinberg Batra. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you also to Jonas Sjöstedt. This was somewhat unexpected that you argued for NATO, because it is by building security with the others to participate fully in these structures where security are being shaped, where we help each other. That is where we can make use of and where we can influence the role of the United States. That is where decisions are being made, and they're being made in consensus together with the USA at a negotiating table, instead of us being alone, being vulnerable, and in this context also a small country who would be bilaterally dependent on, well, all of this that I mentioned, and that is why we need to join.
Thank you. Jonas Sjöstedt? No, Anna Kinberg Batra. Iceland and New Zealand don't have the same amount of power in NATO. The United States make the decisions, and Donald Trump become the supreme commander. You refuse to answer the question of whether you have any faith in his security policy, and then you want to become a member of NATO. And not only that, the second most important military power, that's Turkey. There we have a dictator running Turkey, Erdogan, imprisoning people from the opposition, using the military against the Kurds, for example, autocratic, etc., politician, and you want to be linked to you and link our security policy to these people, because of course it all goes in two ways in a military alliance. You refuse to answer the question whether you have any faith in his security policy. Okay, but what about Erdogan's security policy? Do you have any faith in that?
Tack, herr talman.
Anna Kinberg Batra. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one in this chamber knows anything about what the future US government will do and how they will act, but we need to monitor that situation closely, and that's the only thing we can do. Let us instead look at what we have closer to us, the neighbour Estonia. I just met Kersti Kaljulaid, who just took a position as Prime Minister just before Christmas, and they look at the eastern border that we share, the EU border, the NATO border, and they would not just be there and trust tweets, for example, if Russian aggression was to increase. When things get difficult, then we have mutual agreements in a structure in NATO where decisions are being made in consensus, where all members participate in discussions around the table, and that is where decisions are being made, and it is crucial for Sweden to be able to participate. If not, we will be unilaterally dependent on someone, one president or another, and the whims of those presidents.
Thank you. That is the end of that round. The rejoinders and Anna Kinberg Batra. So we have the next speaker is Jimmie Åkesson from the Sweden Democrats.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, I and a few others have been, well, I guess we could call it criticism, and that we've been criticized because of the gloomy picture we paint, and that might be so, and sometimes perhaps you need to do so, and well, that brings down the mood perhaps in the chamber, and I'm sorry if I've hurt someone's feelings, but this is a fact that there are many problems around us. And then if you take your responsibility, if you're a political representative, if you represent people who actually live in this country, then you also need to be courageous enough to address all those problems that do exist. You can't just pretend that everything is fine and dandy, and you can't just talk about how good your own policy actions are. You also need to be able to address what is really bad, and that is what I do, and that dampens the mood perhaps, and I apologize if that is the case. But there is also light in the end of the tunnel, and I touched upon that as well, Mr. Speaker. In our part of the world, in Europe, in North America, we see people from reality, ordinary people, we see how they stand up against this dominant position that we have seen over decades from the left-wing liberals, and people stand up against the way they've ruined societies, where we haven't had any demands posed anywhere, where we've had segregation, and now instead we try to move towards a more unified society. We need to go back to a situation where we can actually collaborate with each other instead of trying to force everyone to be the same. A society where everyone does his or her duty and then also demand your rights, what you're entitled to. And that is what I want to see, and that is what we see appearing.
Tack.
Thank you. Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, Anna Kinberg Batra, Gustaf Fridolin, Annie Lööf, Jonas Sjöstedt, Jan Björklund, Andreas Karlsson have requested rejoinders. Prime Minister first. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, don't apologise for the gloom and doom, because there are a lot of concerns here that we need to take seriously. The question is only how do we use the political power to ensure that we can turn the tide, so go from worry and concerns to belief in the future. So that's going from tax cuts, cutbacks to tax increases and investing in jobs and schools, etc., and welfare. That's what we need to continue with. Here we have a list on cutbacks proposed. 32 million on social medical, minus 3 million to municipalities and county councils, minus 5.5 billion on social planning and building. And so my question to you, do you recognise these cutbacks at all?
Jimmy Åkesson. Well, Mr. Speaker, I touched upon this during my address, that we see how politicians talk about everything, how good my policy action is now. I, Stefan Löfven, is the Prime Minister, and I've done all these great things. But that is not the case. Things are just as bad now as with the previous government. Almost everything. Well, unemployment is somewhat lower, but we're in a boom in the economy, and that is not thanks to you, Stefan Löfven. That is because other reforms, the job reforms that you've tried to carry out, they have been a total disaster, Mr. Stefan Löfven. You haven't been successful when it comes to increasing security and a sense of security in society. It's the opposite. People feel more insecure. You have not been successful in developing welfare systems. They're more stretched today than ever before. You haven't been able to turn the trend around when it comes to police. The opposite is the case.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Unemployment rate is decreasing, employment increasing. A lot remains to be done, but we're taking the right route. So perhaps I'm a Prime Minister who's very lucky. Well, maybe you should stick to me. And now these cutbacks that I listed here, that Jimmy Åkesson didn't want to comment them at all, did you? These are moderate policy proposals for cutbacks. They want to do this, and it's the same cutbacks that you have voted in favour of, you, the Sweden Democrats. But Jimmy Åkesson doesn't really want to approach this at all. The cutbacks that you said that we want to vote in favour of as long as we get a little bit of the power cake. That is really dubious when it comes to those who are in the most difficult position, and that's so typical of Sweden Democrats. And let's let the people of Sweden know that the leader of the Sweden Democrats doesn't even know which cutbacks he's supported.
Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I represent my own policy. Unfortunately, in this chamber, we have not been successful in getting a majority for our policy proposals, and I regret that, because that would have helped developments. But unfortunately, that is the case. And then, when your own policy is not getting enough of support, then you have to take your responsibility. That is what I think. And I think the responsibility would be to do away with this government, because they haven't been successful with anything, nothing whatsoever. And if you have two evils to choose between, I choose the lesser evil. And that would have been what we've seen in the chamber. I feel that we need to remove Stefan Löfven. He can't continue being the Swedish Prime Minister Minister. I'm going to do everything I can during this mandate and also during the next election campaign to make sure that he does not continue as a Prime Minister.
Kinberg Batra.
Thank you. Anna Kinberg Batra from the Moderate Party has requested a rejoinder. You have the floor.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the National Defence Conference in Sälen in Dalarna the other day, there was a lot of talk of the more aggressive actions perpetrated by Russia, not least trying to influence information and politics here as well. The head of the strategic communication in NATO was there, and information suggests that Russia has increased its capability to take action against Sweden should the need arise. As it were put, if we end up in some sort of dispute where it becomes important to impact and influence Swedish public opinion or Swedish decision makers, we need to be prepared that they have a well-established capability to take actions against us. That's what the Swedish Agency of Civil Preparedness said. I think that was only the other day, and we've also been told by the FRA that agency that there's a real capability to hit Swedish targets. Jimmy Åkesson, how do you relate to this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have the same type of responsibility as Anna Kinberg Batra and everyone else here. The difference is that we have taken our responsibility, whereas the government that Anna Kinberg Batra supported over 8 years and the present government, they haven't taken this seriously. It's not until the last year people have actually understood that there is such a thing as Russian aggression, that there is a potential threat in our immediate neighborhood. Over 25 years we've been using the defense as some place we can get money from to finance other activities, but I've taken my responsibility, and I'm happy to see that other parties as well finally start to understand that they need to have the defense policy on our agenda, that it's about our security, that it needs to be long term, and that we need to spend money on this. I welcome that.
Tack. Anna Kinberg.
Thank you, Anna Kinberg Batra. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not unexpected that Jimmy Åkesson would like the debate to stick to Sweden, be kept at Sweden. But let's look at the US presidential election, for example, where government agencies are able to show that there were attempts to influence opinions perpetrated by Russia, and we know that this goes for other countries and other situations. We're drawing close to the French presidential election, and Marine Le Pen has clear links to Russia, and she has publicly talked of her good relations with Jimmy Åkesson, and there's a risk that we will see new attempts to impact an election campaign. Let's look at the European Parliament, where the Sweden Democrats, members of Parliament, over and over again have contacts with Putin-friendly powers and contacts very difficult to explain for the Sweden Democrats of what the purpose of this would be, etc. You need to take this seriously, and I wonder if the senior party level of the Sweden Democrats are taking this seriously. Why is it that over and over again this happens to the Sweden Democrats, that there are safety and security risk elements coming into the Swedish Parliament, that there's a risk of influencing an upcoming Swedish election campaign?
Jimmy Åkesson, well, Mr. Speaker, it's difficult to debate when the other party of that debate doesn't stick to the truth, where we have exaggerations when talking about things. Then you cannot have a proper discussion. What you're talking about, what you're saying, it's not true, quite simply. I just said from up here that over decades we have been talking about the threat from Russia. We have done that over a decade, and you haven't, Anna Kinberg Batra. It's not until now, when it's topical in media, that you talk about and feel that it's important to talk about this potential threat that we have in our immediate surrounding. I think it's great that the other political parties now finally begin to understand that there is such a threat. It's great, but you shouldn't pretend that you've talked about this over time. You haven't. It's just us who've seen and understood this.
Tack. Nästa replik har begärts av...
Thank you. Gustav Fridolin from the Green Party has requested the next rejoinder. You have the floor.
Herr talman, igår var Sverigedemokraterna...
Yesterday, the Sweden Democrats, Mr. Speaker, threatened the Swedish Meteorological Institute, the SMHI, with a reduced budget, trying to scare and inseminate fear in Swedish government agencies, making them not do their job. It was previously said that there's no link between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global warming. And trying not to be a skeptic, said that other parties are more extreme. We're in the middle. In the middle of what, I wonder? The SMHI Meteorological Institute and Kent Ekeroth's Twitter account, between research and free-flowing imagination. Do Sweden Democrats trust the researchers of the UN climate panel, or do you ignore it altogether? That's what I would like to know.
Tack.
Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson. Well, Mr. Speaker, Gustav Fridolin has built his political career on this issue, become a politician and also a member of the Swedish government because of the climate policy and his work with the climate issue. And I do not understand how this happened, because the only thing that the Green Party has been successful with really is to destroy the structures that we have for climate neutral development. We had that already. Why destroy it? And I feel that this is a case in point when it comes to this debate. I do not deny the fact that carbon dioxide has an impact on climate, or that this climate change is happening, but I'm questioning how efficient our measures are in Sweden, thinking about the global development of the climate. What we do in Sweden will have no impact on the global climate, and therefore it's poor policy.
Gustav Fridolin. Jimmy Åkesson says that we should ask some other country to resolve the climate issue. It's not efficient if we do it. Well, let's look at the parks of Sölvesborg. Jimmy Åkesson seems to think that it's perfectly okay to throw your sweet wrappings in the park, or somebody else threw that. But if we want a clean park, everyone has to stop throwing things on the ground. It's the same with the climate threat. If we're to face up to it, we need to see reductions of emissions from all countries. Everyone has to carry their share of the responsibility. The climate policies will affect us, but a lack of such a policy will make people leave their homes, force them to leave mark they can no longer farm or live on. And wars will break out as a result of natural disasters and climate catastrophes. Do you think we will have more or fewer refugees coming into Sweden if we don't face up to the climate challenge in time, for example?
Thank you, Jimmy Åkesson. Well, thank you. I don't think Gustav Fridolin heard or understood what I said. The policy action that is being taken by Gustav Fridolin and members of government, that allows Poland and other countries to continue with their emissions. That is the real impact on your policy action. And I think that's wrong. People in the Swedish countryside, why should they pay so that people in Poland and Bulgaria can continue with their emissions? I don't understand. I'm not saying that other countries should fix the climate. Of course, this is something where we need collaboration. That's an excellent example of such a thing where we need global collaboration. But to make it more difficult for people living in the Swedish rural areas in order to try to save the global climate, that is an example of bad policy action.
Nästa replik har begärts av
Thank you. Annie Lööf from the Centre Party has the next rejoinder.
Herr talman, min familj.
Mr. Speaker, my family, just like most other families, we have a fire alarm, we have locks on our doors to keep unwelcome visitors away, we've a home insurance and good contacts with our neighbours to make our everyday life more safe and secure. The same principle goes for Sweden, and as political leaders we have a responsibility for the country as a whole and its security, and it takes cooperation with our neighbouring countries to achieve such a position. But in spite of this unrest, the Sweden Democrats have chosen a different path. They're consistently on Putin's side in this European Parliament. They invite to party at the Grand Hotel with Putin-friendly participants. And yes, Jimmy Åkesson, this is also the truth. Regardless of the people Jimmy Åkesson chooses to socialise with. The Sweden Democrats would like Sweden to leave the EU. They've been pushing for that and canvassing for that point for years, in spite of the fact that cooperation is a determining factor to combat organised crime. Why do you want to play Russian roulette with Swedish security, I ask?
Jimmy
Åkesson. Well, Mr. Speaker, Russian roulette. Well, it's great fun. I actually had that in my notes as well, and I was going to use it. But I don't think it's me playing Russian roulette. It's the other political parties who have been doing this for 25 years now. Unfortunately, everyone is laughing at us, and we have talked about a potential military threat against Sweden, and other parties haven't taken this seriously at all. But 25 years have been spent slaughtering, doing away with Swedish defense, and you haven't said anything about that until, well, recently. And it's good that other political parties now begin to understand this, but you shouldn't try to criticize me. It's you. Over 25 years you have underestimated this threat. You were wrong, not me.
Annie Lööf. Mr. Speaker, Jamie Åkesson is shying away from the core issue in what I'm saying. We have very different views on the neighbouring world's importance and relevance to our security. He fails to see the major paradox here, that to get independence you need cooperation. We depend on others for our independence and sovereignty. You get freedom as a result of community and collaboration. Other countries will have more influence on Sweden and Swedish security otherwise, and it is a fact that Jimmy Åkesson only a month or so ago invited clearly Putin-friendly politicians to Sweden to socialise with them, to discuss with them, and it is a fact, Jimmy Åkesson, that you support Putin's line in the European Parliament. Why do you believe that we are stronger if we stand alone? Why should we leave the EU? Why will the Sweden Democrats not try and safeguard and do everything they can to promote Swedish security?
Jimmy Åkesson. Well, Mr. Speaker, we work together with other countries. We do that a lot. Countries in our neighborhood and also in other parts of the world. We have been great at doing that for as long as Sweden has been an independent state, and I think we should continue doing that. But independence, that is the basic. Annie Lööf says that if we're not members of the EU, if we're not members of NATO, etc., then other countries will have more of a say over Swedish policy and developments in Sweden. But come on, EU. What has EU meant? Doesn't it mean that other countries' politicians, people we cannot elect and we cannot depose, they have an unproportional say when it comes to Swedish developments? That is exactly what has happened because, as you said, we collaborate. I do not think this is a cooperation. Cooperation, collaboration, it should be mutual on equal conditions, and EU or NATO will never have such a collaboration.
Thank you. Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Sweden Democrats have been in dispute with many different parts of and entities in society. But I need to talk about the Swedish Meteorological Institute and that you're attacking that agency. It's somewhat surprising, isn't it, that you're choosing them as a target. I know that they do research, they spread and disseminate information and research results, but I have two very concrete questions for Jimmy Åkesson. First of all, could you give an example of where they've been spreading incorrect, erroneous information? Surely that must be the basis for such a drastic attack. And secondly, I wasn't thinking about the weather, but about the climate. Let me clarify that. And secondly, what other government agencies would you like to pinpoint and close down if they're saying things that don't fit with your conception of the world, your perception? Research entities, government agencies, and others who are saying things that are displeasing to the Sweden Democrats.
Jimmy Åkesson. Well, It's difficult to concentrate because I start to think about SMHE, the Meteorological Institute, and what characterizes them and the weather. And I guess you're not really talking about the weather, Jonas Sjöstedt. But this is about appropriations. It's about 13 million less, and that against the backdrop that they've been receiving more money over the last few years. And when you talk about us wanting to close down the Meteorological Institute, that is not the case. We feel, however, that their activities can be made more efficient, and that's all. There isn't that much drama at all. And I do think that if we have national agencies in Sweden that work against Swedish unity and the Swedish society, I'm not talking about SMHI now, the Meteorological Institute, but there might be other examples, and then we should reform those agencies.
Tack. Jonas Sjöstedt, varsågod.
Jonas Sjöstedt. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But of course, Jimmy Åkesson, and you know this as well, the argument to reduce their funding, the allocation, is that they give information on scientific results and facts on the climate, and you're unable to give a single example of where they've actually said something which is erroneous on the matter of climate exchange. So it's all something that you've come up with. It's about politics, nothing else. You want to silence facts, knowledge, science, which doesn't fit your perception of the world, and that to me is your choice. Look at Europe, look at Poland or Hungary and other places. What's happening in a society when the government gives itself the right to silence voices which do not fit their political agenda? This is why this is so serious of an issue. Are there other voices that you would like not to be heard so clearly, that you would like to silence somewhat because they don't fit with your political convictions? That's quite serious, and it's quite different, Jimmy Åkesson.
Jimmy Åkesson. Well, Mr. Speaker, I find it hard to take this seriously. 13 million more or less to the Meteorological Institute compared to, well, what Jonas Sjöstedt is comparing this with authoritarian regimes, young regimes that haven't developed yet, where you try to control public service media, etc. And this comparison, well, come on, you need to be somewhat reasonable when you try to argue about this. We have to be somewhat reasonable when discussing Jonas Sjöstedt. I'm convinced that the Meteorological Institute can be made more efficient and still carry out their tasks without these 13 million. But what Jonas Sjöstedt is saying, that these are undisputable facts. But what they do, as a matter of fact, it's regional forecasts. And you know very well, Jonas Sjöstedt, that these are forecasts. They are not facts. They're interesting as points of debate, but they are not undisputable facts.
Thank you. Jan Björklund from the Liberal Party is next. Mr. Speaker, I've also read the budget proposal from the Sweden Democrats, their budget proposal that Jimmy Åkesson voted in favour of. You're proposing a very drastic reduction in the handicap reform package, the LSS, as it's called in Swedish. It's one of the most important freedom reforms when it was adopted for 16,000 people. It's the difference between life in dignity or in complete lack of dignity. Before this reform package was introduced, people with extensive disabilities had to live in an institutional environment, and children were taken away from their parents because of it. And that's why this reform came about originally. And the government tried to make cutbacks to the reforms and the allocations, but even the government has taken steps in the reverse direction now because the consequences were perceived to be so extensive, not least for children. But you see no problem with that. You're proposing to make savings to the tune of several billions. Why are you choosing to cut back on the most vulnerable in our society?
Jimmy Åkesson. Well, Mr. Speaker, I do not remember the figures offhand, but the cutback that you're referring to, Jan Björklund, I believe, is an outcome of the calculations where we expect that there is less of a need because of our immigration policy. We'll have fewer people who need this assistance, and that is the underlying thought. And I share your opinion, as a matter of fact, Jan Björklund. Since I was a teenager, I've actually lived with this law in my own home, the Act on Assistance for People with Severe Disabilities, because I have such an individual in my family, and I know what it would mean if there were changes made to this. And unfortunately, those changes we've seen over the last year or so. But you can feel safe and secure in knowing that I am not going to contribute to any deterioration there.
That's right, you do have another round of rejoinders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jimmy Åkesson says that I can rest safe, but he's not going to contribute to any deterioration. But I have the voting list here. You voted in that direction in December. I can read it here. 2 billion, and how this would be done with reduced immigration from the 1st of January a few weeks ago is absolutely incomprehensible to me. Of course it's a cutback. It's a reduction, and if you have personal experience, I fail to understand why he would table such a proposal and vote in favour of it. Jimmy Åkesson can hear now take back this and say, we no longer represent this, we take it back. It's impossible to make savings on reduced immigration on the 1st of January when it's the 11th of January today. I don't understand what you mean.
Jimmy Åkesson. Well, Mr. Speaker, no, and perhaps Jan Björklund, perhaps you don't understand what we mean, but then I think then you have to look at what we based our proposal on, those calculations. In fact, you can't just sort of make it all up. I mean, it's that we have a basis for our calculations actually, and I'm sure that that's right. So that's the point of departure. But I will not, let me repeat, I will not work in favour of any deterioration of the LSS Act at all. And so please feel safe about that. Secure. Thank you. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. That round, and next is Andreas Karlsson from the Christian Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The security policy situation of the world around us has changed and deteriorated greatly over the past few months. The Islamist terrorism, the armament in Russia, etc., have changed the situation in the debate in society. I've seen and heard Jimmy Åkesson speak up in this matter. He's been condemning Islamist terrorism, but Russia is the gravest military threat to Sweden, and I haven't really noticed Jimmy Åkesson very much being present in that debate, even though here in this debate he's saying that the Sweden Democrats have addressed this over a long period of time. So here's my question to Jimmy Åkesson. Is Jimmy Åkesson in agreement with the assessment that Russia represents the most serious military threat to Sweden, and what are your conclusions, if so, of that fact?
Mr. Speaker, at least twice in a rejoinder here, I'm in fact explained that I don't know, and I don't know, I mean, we have to be careful how you express yourself. I think we need to be very careful and cautious, say that Russia constitute the major threat, the biggest military threat, because that's not how I would put it. I would say that it's the biggest potential threat, perhaps. Not perhaps vis-à-vis Sweden, but vis-à-vis other states in our close proximity. And I think we need to be very careful how we put things. But otherwise, yes, I have said this. My party friends have said this for decades. Several party leader debates. We've said it when we've said that we, as the only party, when we want to increase allocations to defence here in this parliament, where you, Andreas Karlsson, where you've been laughing at us and said, well, there's no threat, you've said. And your friends in the alliance, you've said, well, no, Russia is going towards a democracy. It's not a problem.
Andreas Karlsson, Christian Democrats. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we've debated this from the early parts of this century in this chamber, so hearing Jimmy Åkesson speak up now is no surprise. And your talk of strengthening our defence, needless to say, we also support a policy to improve our defence capability in the short term. But we understand in the Christian Democratic Party that we're not stronger if we stand alone. We need to work together with same like-minded countries, and we've come to the conclusion that the most efficient way of combating a Russian invasion and avoiding Russian aggression in our close proximity vicinity would be to join NATO, to work with other NATO countries as an efficient tool to safeguard Sweden and our security, the security of the region surrounding us. Why are you opposed to NATO membership, I wonder?
Mr. Speaker, even if Andreas Carlsson says that they have since the beginning of the century seen this and said this, well, it's not reflected in the policy that has been pursued, at least not in the 8 years in power that you had, and either before or after either, actually. Although you perhaps have changed your view recently, which I welcome, of course. However, when it comes to NATO membership, yes, okay, you can make that assessment that Andreas Carlsson and the other alliance parties have done. But you can also, with credibility, make a different assessment, which might not perhaps entail, which might be different. But I don't know whether there's anybody here who's against cooperating with other countries when it comes to safety or security policy. We're doing that already today. We have the partnership, for example. We've got the EU. You can say what you like about that, but we're there anyway. So the cooperation is there in place, which has been good. I think we should reinforce cooperation, absolutely, especially with Finland.
Thank you. That concludes this round of rejoinders on Jimmy Åkesson's address. Gustav Fridolin is our next speaker.
Herr talman,
Mr. Speaker, it's serious now. The ice wouldn't cover the Arctic area as in previous years. Back in the autumn, it was close to zero a few days before Christmas at the Arctic Circle. In June, we saw the first mammal being extinct as a result of the climate change. This impacts every area of politics. We need to turn the emissions around. The exports of tomorrow depend on whether we can find solutions for the whole world. Security policies are determined always by the allocation of resources. And for those of you who've taken sides that you don't like people to be helped when they are fleeing for their lives from war, you have also taken a stand with drought, natural disasters, wars breaking out as a result of climate change. The world is crying out for leadership, and Sweden can show that there's a better society behind and beyond throwing things away. We need to recycle rather than throwing away, not getting more and more out of the earth's crust to make more and more gear. We need green cities, vibrant, dynamic, rural area. It's very difficult to understand why we need to stand and take the same debate over every single investment, every single improvement. We want all the opposition parties are cutting their green budgets by more than 25%, saying no to aviation, carrying the brunt of its own costs, objecting to reducing truck transports and road transports. Anna Kinberg-Batra, Jimmy Åkesson, Annie Lööf, Jan Björklund, Andreas Carlsson. How much warmer does the Arctic have to get before you take the climate threat seriously?
Rejoinders have been requested by Anna Kinberg-Batra, Annie Lööf, Jonas Sjöstedt and Jan Björklund. Let's start with Anna Kinberg-Batra from the Moderate Party. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's serious, says Gustav Fridolin, as regards climate, and that's also the case when it comes to security and defence. Now, earlier in the last few days, we've said how important it is to reinforce defence, and then the Prime Minister says, bingo, he says, which is rather unexpected for a serious party leader. But I'm therefore going to turn to the leader of the second party in power, as we have two. And the defence spokesman of your party, when we proposed a reinforcement, let me quote, we have a deterioration as regards security situation, and we see that your arguments were relevant. So let me ask you now, in this debate, how far are you prepared to reinforce defence already this year? And the Green Party, how are you going to take your responsibility as part of the government to improve our ability to quickly, to do this? Because it's serious.
Gustav Fridolin, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Defence Commission, of course, is the answer. So we need to have this sort of entity, this body, but the moderate party have requested it loud and clear. It's appointed, and before it has time to even begin its work, the moderate party secretariat has already looked into how much more money is needed. This is just not a serious approach. We need to sit down together. We need to look at the cost of raising the Swedish defence capacity and capability as needed. The single most important security policy issue in the future is the climate threat. Russia's power is growing from oil and gas chambers. It's the matter of resources that create the security policy situation we are in right now. And if we fail to stop the climate change in time, we will see more conflict, more wars breaking out, and this is the single most important security policy issue, and you're lacking a proper action.
Thank you, Mrs. Speaker. Well, if the government had reacted more quickly with regard to the gas pipeline, the new Russian one, then I think perhaps we would be in a better place when it comes to security policy. Perhaps let's hope it's not too late to do so now. But Gustav Fridolin, he's wrong when it comes to the Commission. The reason why I wanted it to be done already last year was we need to, in fact, after 2020, we need to prepare everything as early as possible. It's important, and I still believe that that's important. We need to get going as quickly as possible, but 2020, we've got several years until we get there. So my questions, my proposals are with regard to how we, above and beyond the reinforcement of defence that we, the moderate party, that we pushed forward last year, how we now today, when the situation in the world is deteriorating faster, then so that we can reinforce our situation with, for example, better equipment, better ammunition to defend ourselves, how we can do what we are able to do here and now when the situation is as it is. Things are deteriorating now, today. Not just about climate, climate as all in the world.
Gustav Fridolin. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting sometimes, politics. The right-wing government permitted, enabled the gas pipeline across the Baltic seabed in spite of the difficult effects and impacts this would have with links to a Russian company. Now the company would like to position a second pipeline next to the old one. And our possibilities of taking action is difficult. Our possibilities are limited because the right-wing government allowed the first one to be located there. And now we hear from the right-wing parties. It's a bit like just after the Swedish Parliament adopted its decision on the allocation of the budget to defence, when in December they voted not to allocate a single krona more to the defence. Now they're crying out for more money. It's just not serious, Anna Kinberg Batra. It's not acceptable. I understand that you give priorities according to your wishes and desires in the right-wing government, and but we're listening to the world around us. But be serious in your arguments.
Next, Annie Lööf.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, Camilla Lindgren and Tora Toll run Bränningevägen, a preschool. It's a small preschool with small groups of children, and language. The importance of language is the focus there. And they earlier worked for the municipality, but 5 years ago they dared take that step and in fact set up their own school to help these preschool children get the best possible start possible. Now, Camilla and Tola, they have got no major margins. It's not a big company. They're not venture capitalists. They have invested their time, their own money, their drive to create quality and to promote choice. Now, but if your actions, if your proposals come into force, then they will not be able to run the school. Not just the services that are included in this will be affected, but also the children. So therefore, a question to you, Gustav Fridolin, what are you going to say to these concerned parents and staff? Do you want to be the school minister who let every fourth preschool in Sweden shut down?
Gustav Fridolin from the Green Party. Mr. Speaker, no. But I would very much like to have a set of rules and regulations that make it possible for the parents and the entrepreneurs you've mentioned can feel safe in the knowledge that when you get entrusted with a welfare commission, and the most important ones are in schools and preschools, you've also promised that the money you get allocated shall benefit children and young adults. I don't want to ever read again about preschools making savings, serving the children water and bread. But these are exemptions. Most of them are very, very serious in their approach, and they work precisely the way Annie Lööf has just described. But make sure that we have these rules and that they apply to all entities so that the parents can freely choose between different preschools. We want it to be well prepared and we want it to work properly. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, but I think you're closing your eyes for the obvious. Of course, it should be the same quality requirements for all, but that's not the point here. That's not what you're discussing here. The proposal there is not just limiting choice. What you're doing is that you're going to see that popular activities are going to be closing down, and that is in fact part of your proposal. And that's the signals that leading politicians are sending out. You just close shop. Small companies, often run by women. You're not bothered about this, and you don't want to have them. Then there's no place for them in Gustaf Fridolin, Sweden, and that's come from a feministic government. Why won't you fight for these preschools? Why, the Green Party, do you want to close these preschools? Because that will be the consequence of your proposals if you listen to the owners of these small preschools.
Gustaf Fridolin. Mr. Speaker, this is a matter of political priority. And it's important to know that this government will prioritise, we do prioritise preschools. The number of children in each group in preschool increased during the previous government. We've done away with rules to regulate that. This very quality requirements you're talking about, and there were more children in each group in preschools. We've reintroduced a research-based objective. We're allocating government means to assist government and local government entities to improve the situation, and finally we can start looking forward to having fewer children in each group. That's quality in the preschools. We fight for all of them, the independent ones and the publicly run ones, and we want to ensure with our proposals that all government funds can be availed of by the children and for the children with proper players involved. Annie Lööf has now used 26 of the 30 minutes she has available to her, and there hasn't been a word on the climate.
Next, we have Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party.
Herr talman, Gustaf Fridolin.
Gustaf Fridolin. Tomorrow, the European Parliament and the Environmental Committee is voting on CETA, the step between closing the gap between the EU and Canada, and probably they will vote no. I hope that your colleagues will vote no, and there are very strong arguments to vote no to CETA. Gabriel was also, for example, from Canada. They are a power when it comes to minerals, and they are running a very controversial mining project, Roșia Montana in Romania, where they have destroyed they want to destroy a whole village, and the Romanians have said no from environmental reasons, but now they are taking the country to court. They want 4 billion in return. That's half of the Romanian budget, because the Romanians put the environment before profit. See, this is with CETA. Then you have companies that can sue countries. And why do you want to give companies this power?
Tack, herr talman.
Gustaf Fridolin, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Jonas Sjöstedt for addressing this. These agreements are difficult. Free trade is good. Rules are good too, and the rules and provisions need to be designed in such a way that some countries can move ahead in favor of the environment, healthcare, protection of animals and animal welfare. It's been very important to ensure that we don't get an implementation and an adoption of agreements that don't fulfill these requirements, and Green parties in different countries keep working towards this goal. We work in the Green group in the European Parliament. We're a member of the government here in Sweden. There are modern dispute resolution mechanisms, other improvements in international agreements, and we have been successful in various ways. And if you've been pushing this as a government, it becomes very difficult once you're successful to say, yes, we were successful, but we're still going to say no to it. That's not how it works. You need to work in different ways in different fora. And in the government, we ensure that the agreement is as good an agreement as possible.
Thank you very much, Jonas Sjöstedt. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But that's it, isn't it? That this investment protection is there, that you haven't succeeded, that you're expanding the possibility for companies like Able Resources to sue Sweden, Romania, if we reduce their profits. That's why your party friends in Brussels tomorrow will vote no to this agreement. It's not different agreements in Brussels and in Stockholm. It's the same agreement. And when you in the government here in Sweden are in favour of the investment protection, then you are increasing the power of these major corporations. That is what you're doing. The investment protection hasn't been taken out. There's no democratic insight, which is put, and these companies are sort of put above your national parliaments, and you're doing it against the Green Party's will, and your own MEPs are voting that way. But why don't you here in Sweden?
Gustav Fridolin, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This was a good exchange of rejoinders because it shows very clearly one of many differences between the Green Party and the Left Party, because we believe that it is a good thing that there is trade with people. We do it in a way that reduces transports, that we can improve the environment, improve healthcare in different ways. I think the Left Party probably has its approach to many of this, but also in how we perceive politics. Politics, of course, is about making a difference. Is the Left Party of the opinion that it is bad for Sweden to have a government that has pushed a different level of investment protection than that represented and canvassed by the previous government, that we now have a government that's giving a better way of allowing countries to move forward when possible? But the Left Party didn't want to be involved in that. They want to sit in this chamber and have the right opinions, but over the course of 100 years never really implementing anything like this. Thank you. Moving on to the next round of rejoinders with Jan Björklund.
Mr. Speaker, I would like the Education Minister to say something about education in this debate. 80% of pupils, they feel that they're working harder when they get grades. 80% also feel that they can improve their grades by making more of an effort. And this is a survey for a grade 6 after we've introduced grades there. And most headmasters, in fact, say that it's easier to get results to increase and improve. And teachers say it's easier to find the weaknesses in pupils. Now, Gustav Fridolin, shouldn't the Green Party get rid of its opposition to grades? Come on.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, we have no intention to start to do this and that with the grading system. When I stepped into a teacher's room, one of the first jokes I heard was new government, new grading system. And we do not want to do that. We want to look at what really makes a difference. And what the investigation showed us was that in spite of the new system with the grades, the pupils who need help, they haven't really gotten it, which is not strange because, Jan Björklund, you wanted more grades and less teachers for those who really need extra help. And grades will not help that equation. We need more teachers and more time with teachers, not less. So we want to help strengthening those competencies for special teachers, for children with special needs, and we want to ensure that teachers have more time with their pupils and that we can give more support to those children in time.
Oh, come on. Yeah. Gustav Fridolin says he doesn't want to dismantle the grading system. Well, perhaps that would contribute to you leaving the government, because of course there is a majority in favour of grading. Now 80% are working harder. Don't you understand that that is a very important reason as to why the PISA results have changed and improved? Because the pupils are working harder because of grades, and that's what's happened. And we see those pupils, those who did the PISA tests in the spring of 2015, they were the first who got earlier grades, and suddenly things are getting better after decades of ridiculous school policies where we've all gone the wrong direction. Pupils are working harder, and I agree that we need more special needs teachers. I mean, it was the Social Democrats who got rid of that training. I was the one who reintroduced that training for special needs teachers, and we see that's thanks to us, because we introduced that. But special needs teachers is not enough, because most don't need specialties. Most pupils need incentives to learn at school.
Thank you, Gustav Fridolin. Well, Mr. Speaker, yet again, I think it's great fun to hear Jan Björklund talk about schools again. We haven't heard much lately. And the Swedish PISA results have shown a steady decline. And I know that Jan Björklund very much wants to see this PISA result as the best thing that's ever happened. And yes, it's good if things can be turned around, but we're back to the level we had in 2010, and we see more uncertainty in the system. What conditions our children come from, how they grew up, that has more and more of an impact on school results. So I do think that we should perhaps not talk that much about a victory. We should deal with problems instead. 80% of pupils feel that they can do more, that they can make more of an effort. But the other 20%, teachers, they talk about grades early on, that it's making things even more difficult for those children who had a hard time already before.
Andreas Karlsson now for the next round of rejoinders. Mr. Speaker, I read in the newspaper yesterday, or perhaps if it was the day before, and I was rather surprised actually when Gustav Fridolin said that now the Green Party is going to become a party that really is going to be hard on crime, which is great to read, but rather surprising, which is why I'd like Gustav Fridolin to perhaps tell us a little bit more about your view on the Green Party becoming a party which prioritises law and order, because in the autumn in the party leader debate we were standing here in this chamber and asked the question to Isabella Löfven about their crime policy and investments in the police, and the response there was it was more about a green and climate policy, etc., rather than getting more people to enter into the profession and stay in the profession, in law and order professions. So I hope that perhaps you can give a better response here today. Now, Gustav Fridolin, within its new profile, can you then support our proposal about more police officers?
Well, thank you. The government is investing in the police. We have more people employed in the police force than ever before, and we now have 600 new police officers who are employed on an hourly basis. And we're working hard. We want to create good urban environments, and that's also about bicycle roads, and it's about making sure that areas are safe. This is urban developments. That is what it's all about, and you can belong to the Green Party and you can want to accomplish this as much as you work with climate policy. I think that three things are important. I think that we detect criminals early on, before crimes are detected, and if we have young offenders, we should be allowed to use electronic surveillance to make sure that they're home at night. And thirdly, we should also make sure that we have people employed in schools that can coordinate with society.
Thank you very much. The government's investments in the police is after the next general election. We would like to invest in the police already in this year's budget, but okay, at least we got a response to that question. Let me put another question. In this chamber, when we voted on making the sentencing for burglaries stricter, more stringent, you said no to that, so that a burglary, this is something that causes worry, especially amongst older people and people living in rural areas, and making those sentences stricter that violate our integrity and means that people want to move from their own homes because they feel insecure in their homes. You voted against that. We Christian Democrats, we together with the Alliance, we in fact got this through. Had the Green Party, have you changed view on this so that we ensure that there is stricter sentencing with regard to burglaries, so that we can prioritise this type of crime now with your new profile, the Green Party?
Gustav Fridolin. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're looking at the penalties to make sure that we use the right means to find the perpetrators. And we know that burglaries are the most provoking crime amongst general population, so we need to have a higher clearance rate there for burglaries. And we also need to ensure that we're quicker to get to those young offenders, so that we do not just apprehend them and then send them back to the streets to their criminal gangs again. And that is what we focus on from the government. And then, of course, we also need to look at the police, and we need to employ more people. Now we can't just wait until after the next elections. It's about resources, and it's also about making sure that we have a proper new organization for the police force.
Thank you very much. That's the end of that round. Back to the speakers list, and we have Annie Lööf from the Centre Party is next.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, people who live outside the major cities, they often feel that they sort of living in forgotten Sweden. In Maramö, for example, a village in Småland, there are no buses, no broadband, no supermarket. I know how they feel. And they have different preconditions, and the National Party leader debate should also be about them, about their conditions and preconditions, about the rural areas, jobs, companies, etc. So my first address this morning, I did in fact emphasize this, that it should apply for the whole country, in the rural areas, in country areas, in urban areas, in cities and towns. This is really the basis to ensure that the whole country can live, that everyone is at work, that we can invest in infrastructure and services. Another thing that's important when we talk about people around the country, it's also about a sense of security. So whether you live in a suburb or in a rural area, you should feel a sense of security. Welfare is a very important part of this sense of security, that there is a school, that is good quality, that we don't have to queue for hours to get care, regardless of whether you live in Malmö, Norrbotten or Gothenburg. Another parameter when talking about the sense of security is also about accessibility and availability of the police. That the police should be able to, in fact, go and, for example, to investigate when they get calls. Sometimes, for example, they can't because they haven't got enough resources, which is unacceptable. We need to do something about it. And a third parameter when we're talking about sense of security in the whole country is about security, and it's that Sweden should be a safe place, a secure place, that we have a strong defence regardless of where we live. We need to ensure that we have a safe and secure country. We need reforms for jobs, and we need to create this sense of security. And I think 2017 is going to be better than 2016. We need to replace worries with hope, and we need to also attack populism. We need a new leadership, and we also need to show that the Alliance and the Centre Party show you the way.
Thank you. Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, Fridolin, Green Party, and Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party have asked for rejoinders, and we'll start with the Prime Minister, please.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jobs in rural areas. You should not be in government together with the Moderate Party, because that will create fewer jobs in rural areas. You should know that. And one other issue where we have uncertainty, that is the migration policy. And you asked me if I feel ashamed over the Social Democratic Party standing for openness and tolerance, and that in combination with the immigration policy. And the answer is no. We have always worked for a regulated immigration policy. We have looked at border controls and immigration control, and that was absolutely necessary with the situation. 80,000 individuals over 2 months who applied for asylum in Sweden, and that jeopardized the system. And in such a situation, all politicians have to take the responsibility and act in Sweden and also in the EU. From the right-wing alliance, we hear different messages, and perhaps you should talk to the Moderate Party and Anna Kinberg Batra and look at what they're saying.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the question from the Prime Minister. Migration, integration issues, these are incredibly important, yes. And 2015, the autumn, the Centre Party, together with the other alliance parties, we had an agreement on migration with the Stefan Löfven's party and the Green Party, and I'm proud of that. But both sides had to compromise, and we agreed on a lot of things, and I stand for that compromise. But since then, or after that rather, very quickly the government did more for example, that children wouldn't be able to see their parents. So I'm going to ask this question: aren't you ashamed, Stefan Löfven, are you ashamed of having introduced the sort of legislation which is at the bottom level of the EU, that 3-4-year-olds can't see their mother or father again. I know it's temporary, this legislation, but as a political leader, you also need to support basic values. I don't think it's humane to separate children from their parents.
Prime Minister. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has done what was necessary to manage that exceptional situation. And Annie Lööf, you know that almost all the refugees came towards the end of the fall. And you should ask Anders Kinberg Batra this question. You need to understand what the right-wing alliance stands for when it comes to migration policy. We want to fight for these values, but we also say that we needed to take those measures because the situation was exceptional and we couldn't receive all those individuals. We've never seen flows like that before. And we do not want to create shadow societies. Maybe you would accept something like that, but we do not want to see that. So we have different views. But the question remains, the right-wing parties, which policy should persist? Annie Lööf or Kinberg Batra?
Mr. Speaker, let me answer the question. It was the Centre Party. It wasn't the Centre Party or Moderate Party or the Alliance Party. It was a compromise of both. And this is what happens, actually, when different parties work together. There's a mixture of each respective party's policy. Now, what is the basis of this is that, and you can see that in the migration agreement that the Alliance concluded with the government in 2015 and other documentation that we've written on this. You've seen our budgets that we submit every autumn, where we have joint wording there about responsible migration policy, etc. Now, what's important when talking about migration policy is about keeping things in order. It's about responsibility, taking action, but it's also about supporting the idea of seeking asylum and also children being reunited with their mother or father. Now, I'm prepared to fight for that. Order and humanism, that's the way forward.
Thank you. And we continue with Gustav Fridolin, Green Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the Alliance asked the government service, the Parliament services to look at the areas of exclusion. How many areas do we have where it's more common that adults do not have a job than having a job, where children grow up under difficult circumstances and where we have this breeding bed for criminality, for gangs? And the investigation, well, the results were devastating. Between 2006 and 2014, when we had an alliance government, we saw 25% more such areas of exclusion, marginalization, with more people growing up in marginalization. And I have a question, and I'm sure that Annie Lööf has thought about this quite a bit. Perhaps you have an answer. Where in your government policy did this happen, that we increased those areas with exclusion?
Herr talman, jag ska svara.
Mr. Speaker, let me answer that. Because also, when I was the Minister for Industry, I in fact emphasised those challenges. In many of my speeches, I said how difficult it was for many industrial areas where they're marginalised situation of unemployment, marginalisation, people are forgotten about, that we need to introduce reforms there for the labour market. So we proposed a number of reforms, both within the labour market, labour legislation, apprenticeships, for example, and reforms for companies as well, which are the basis to turn the tide. And we also proposed reforms for schools to be sort of better, more present. And I think that, Gustav Fridolin, I think that you're aware of the problems here, but we wanted to reduce the level of marginalisation together with other alliance parties, and many jobs grew in our period, and many people who were born abroad, in fact, got those jobs. But of course, a lot more could have been done.
That's good.
Gustav Fridolin. Well, Mr. Speaker, I understand the answer as in yes, those areas with marginalisation, with exclusion, they did increase. That is what we see from the parliamentary services. And I have to say that I think this has to do with financial policy. And we recently heard from a professor that we see increased inequalities where much of that started after the financial crisis. And this is about parents not being allowed to get insurance money from the insurance offices, that you work with schools so that they exclude pupils, and that people stay in unemployment. So you have had a policy for inequalities, and that is what we're suffering from now.
Mrs. Speaker, no, I think I'm a bit more humble than that. The Centre Party reforms hadn't helped on their own. I think it's teamwork, and I'm happy to continue that teamwork together with the Alliance Party. But reducing inequality there, we need reforms for jobs and for companies to move people from marginalisation into making a living for themselves. And what's the basis of this is, it's all about jobs, isn't it, when it comes down to it? And you can see that according to the government's own budget forecast, Sweden will have about 1 million people who are marginalised in a few years' time. And the majority of these people are especially excluded and marginalised. So they're even further from the labour market, which means that your recipe is a recipe of a disaster and goes very against the grain, and it's not in accordance with what you're saying, because what we need to do is we need to invest in the whole country, we need to invest in jobs, we need to reduce regional social gaps, and we have the leadership for that, to reform Sweden, and that's the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll continue with Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Centre Party also talk about themselves as being a green party. They say that they have the best climate policy in the alliance, and perhaps that is the case looking at the right-wing alliance. But looking at your policy and your policy measures, the basic idea that you have is that the polluter should pay, that it should cost to ruin the environment. But when it comes to airlines, you want that to be free. An assistant nurse who drives to work, she has to pay tax on the petrol that she's using. But if you're a business traveler and you fly to New York, there's no tax whatsoever on that airfare, which means that we see an increase in flying that ruins the environment, and we see an uneven competition between what's friendly to the environment and why it's not. Why should air traffic not carry its own costs?
Mr. Speaker, it's not just the Centre Party. We're saying we have the best environmental policy. In the Aftonbladet, an Initio survey, for example, 30% say in a poll that the Centre Party have the best green politics. We come out on top. So the new, we want what gives the best results. I'd very much like aviation to carry its own costs. And I would very much like to accept higher costs to replace the fuel, to have more biofuels for the aviation sector, for example. But in the investigation for the upcoming airline tax, saying that it will shift from airline to cars, we're not emphasizing the climate perspective. We need to focus on the climate impact. So we need efficient tax. An efficient tax system which will really have an impact. The way it's devised right now, it'll only mean an increased cost. And so no emissions will reduce. They'll only reduce to the tune of what the section of garden tools represents. No more than that. You need to design a tax that will have an impact.
Jonas Sjöstedt, well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, this is not. This doesn't hold. Low wage earners should pay taxes when driving a car, but when you travel around the world, you shouldn't pay any taxes for those emissions caused by airline traffic. This is not sustainable. Thinking about the increase of airline traffic, there is a solution. The income that we get from taxing fuel for airline companies, well, that should be used to lower prices for rail travel, and we should give SJ the opportunity to invest in new infrastructure and in new materials. And those who fly a lot, they should help ensure that trains are cheaper. They should always be cheaper. If you travel from Stockholm to Gothenburg, it should always be cheaper to use the train. Trains should be cheaper than airlines, and that is not the case today, and I regret the fact that you're not willing to accept this.
That's good.
Thank you, Annie Love. Mr. Speaker, we are ready to take the right decisions, and the right decisions will entail making decisions on measures that will have an impact. the ones that will give a better climate, reduce emissions. But when the researchers themselves say that they will just transfer it from the airline industry from aviation to cars, then you're more interested in introducing a tax than to have a tax system that really has a climate impact. I'd very much like the aviation to pay for its own costs. I can imagine other types of tax to get rid of fossil fuels and have more of biofuels. I can look at international systems to really make sure that the aviation will carry its own cost. And if we are talking about the rail traffic, we're putting more money in our budget than you do in the government budget from the Left Party on the maintenance and upkeep of the tracks and railway system in the next few years. But we're introducing a tax that won't have any effect. It won't improve the environment. If we can find such a tax instead, we're very much ready to support it.
Thank you. All those rejoinders are concluded. And we continue with Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We live in uncertain times, and we see a lot of turbulence around us. We see a very authoritarian development in Russia. We've seen that over time, and there's no real possibilities to have an opposition in Russian society today. They have attacked the neighboring countries, they have annexed Crimea, and they have also contributed to the situation in Eastern Europe. But this is not a military threat against Sweden today, but of course this means that we have a deterioration in the security situation in Europe. There are other signs of concern as well. Turkey looked quite hopeful for, well, a few years ago, but today they're heading towards dictatorship, and we also see worrisome developments in countries like Poland. And Trump, well, we do not know what this will mean, probably nothing good. And in such a situation, we need countries who stand up for human rights and democracy. We need countries who work for shared solutions in international issues like the climate threat, who work for the Paris Agreement. We need countries who can criticize human rights abuses regardless of who commits them. Sweden and our military non-alignment, that is the best foundation for such a policy. When trying to align us with NATO, well, I feel that that would weaken our possibilities to work for disarmament and human rights across the globe. We need to have our own defense capabilities, and therefore it's good to increase funding. We should also have compulsory service for everyone, and we should have a proper civil defense. And the defense forces also need to use their money properly so that we get good value for money, like what is being done in Finland, for example. Thank you.
Request for rejoinders from Annie Lööf, Gustaf Fridolin, Annie Lööf and Andreas Karlsson. Starting with Gustaf Fridolin for the Green Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important that we have sufficient tax revenue to invest in schools so that people can gain knowledge, build a life for themselves and contribute to the common good. But there are good taxes and bad taxes. Good taxes are the ones which, for example, can help us get to grips with environmental degradation. Bad taxes are the ones which will hamper people's possibilities to build a life for themselves. In 2004, we made an agreement with the Left Party to do away with inheritance tax because it was a bad tax. The wealthy people did away with it through planning. It hit very hard if somebody died an early death, and it hit industries and green industries in particular. We need more of those after the green transition. But now the Left Party are announcing time and time again, this inheritance tax we abolished 12 years ago, we'd like to reintroduce it again. Why, Jonas Sjöstedt? What did you understand back in 2004 that you no longer understand?
För det
Jonas Sjöstedt. Well, Gustav Fridolin, 62 people across the globe, they have the same wealth as the rest of the globe's population, which is quite incredible. And they are burdened to the Earth's resources. They also have a lot of political power. And if this developments continue, we'll see a microscopic part of the population having most of the wealth. And therefore we need a tax on wealth and big inheritances. I don't care about ordinary inheritances, a house or something like that, but if we do not do anything, that gap will just increase. It's not sustainable financially, ecologically, or also from the perspective of equality in society. These people do not live in a sustainable manner, and that's what we have to do. And I think it's strange, the Green Party, you're actually defending the billionaires in Sweden, and that's hard to believe. And if we do not do anything, if we do not have tax on capital, their wealth will just increase.
Gustav Fridolin. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think there's the odd billionaire here or there who doesn't quite agree, who probably feels that it's not very pleasant that you have to pay taxes for emissions or all those airline trips you take. But the inheritance tax was never paid by the billionaires. They got rid of it through planning. It hit the farmer who wanted a generational shift in his operations. It affected families where one parent passed away much too soon. That's why we got rid of inheritance tax. With the Gudrun Schyman-led left-wing party and Lars Bäckström. And then came Lars Ohly. And suddenly all tax was excellent. As soon as a sentence or a word contained the letters tax, they wanted it, no matter what harmful effect it might produce. I thought the Left Party was moving away from that you could sit down and sensibly agree on good taxes and bad taxes, and which would hamper entrepreneurship.
Jonas Sjöstedt, well, taxes do not have any value by themselves, but we need them to finance welfare. And today we have a situation where it's better to have money than to work. And we have a tax system that's rigged to benefit the wealthy people. And that is what we want to change. We want it to be more equal. It should be better for pensioners and people running small companies. But you're defending the system as is. And we're talking about wealth and inheritances being taxed. If you have inherited billions, why shouldn't you pay 1 krona in tax? It's not reasonable. Where were you the last few years when we had the financial debate talking about Piketty and others? They have proven how much of a skew there is in how wealth is distributed. And this also has to be socially sustainable. Have you forgotten about that?
Thank you. We continue with the rounds of rejoinders. Annie Lööf is next from the Centre Party.
Herr talman,
Mr. Speaker, for some children and teenagers, there's oppression and threats. Young girls are under the threat of being brought out of the country to be gender mutilated based on an erroneous and skewed argument on honour factors. There's no room for this in our society. We need to stand up for the rights of women and for children, and we've proposed, amongst other things, a protective piece of legislation to prevent girls and women from being brought to the country to be married off or mutilated, a gender mutilator. It could be, for example, decided not to permit a victim to leave, or a person under this threat to leave the country. I would like you to be much clearer in your objections to violence and threats based on honour arguments. There's criticism within your party as well that you're failing the women of suburbs. So my question to Jonas Sjöstedt is whether you in the left-wing party would be prepared to support such a legal act to prevent women and children to be brought to the country.
Jonas Sjöstedt. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that Annie Lööf can teach us much. We wanted to criminalize this with removing children from the country, and we had a vote on children getting married here in this chamber. We were the only party who voted again. You voted against such legislation, and this is very important. We need to fight this type of criminality and oppression, and you are not doing enough. We have an enormous problem. This is heinous oppression. We need to fight it with all means, and I don't think you can teach us much. I don't know if more can be done in terms of legislation. I haven't studied your proposal in detail, but we need more than symbolic measurements. We need to do something real, something tangible to fight this type of criminality, and I'm prepared to look at all proposals.
Annie Lööf. Mr. Speaker, Jonas Sjöstedt and the Left Party are emphasizing their work against honor-based oppression, and that's laudable, but I'm not criticizing you only because you're afraid of taking the debate. The criticism is coming internally from within your party, that you haven't had the energy to stand up and defend those most exposed, that you're failing women in the suburbs. This is something that's been said internally in your party. You've done a lot of laudable things, but you're not strong enough to take the debate. I welcome Jonas Sjöstedt back into the game, because we need to be more. All parties need to stand up for the rights of women and children, both in Hudiksvall and in the suburb of Husby outside Stockholm. And here's my question once again to Jonas Sjöstedt. Are you prepared to look at our proposal to introduce an act of protection so that women and children cannot be brought out of the country against their will?
Jonas Sjöstedt, well, I've already given you my reply. We're willing to look at each and every proposal. And I think you should, and we should do everything we can to fight this. And I dislike your criticism. You have nothing. You have nothing in concrete terms that you've done differently. This is just very broad argument, and it's dishonest to present things like this. And it's dishonest. I've written a book about the life of a woman who almost got killed because of the honor culture. And it wasn't published because it wasn't possible, but I'm never going to stand back. I'm never going to accept being falsely accused either.
Thank you. Moving on, Andreas Carlsson from the Christian Democrats.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 31% of all women in Sweden feel so insecure that they choose sometimes not to go out. This is according to this year's report from the Swedish Crime Prevention Council. This is frightening reading, and we heard that from the senior representatives of the council as well when they presented the report. Amongst the elderly and women, we see the biggest increase. The rapid increase is due to fear of sexual crime. According to the National Council, this needs to be taken very seriously. The Christian Democrats would like to raise the penalties for sexual crime. If you are an asylum seeker and you're convicted, you should be rejected. You have your asylum application rejected and be expulsed from this country, for example. I'd like to ask Jonas Sjöstedt, who represents a feminist party, when one woman in three is scared sometimes of leaving the home, are you prepared to sharpen and raise the penalties?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do believe that we need to do several things. Penalties, yes. But the most serious thing is that most of these crimes are never prosecuted, and there are things that are much more complicated than what you're talking about with strengthening the penalties. We want to have an act on consent and also on negligence, and that will prevent these crimes to be committed. It will also be easier to have convictions, and that will make the responsibility clearer. And I would like to see that we have all political parties included. We should create that legislation. It's important. I also think that we need to increase the knowledge amongst the police officers. They need to be able to conduct these investigations properly. And there are areas where we needed to have more severe sentences. That is correct. And I'm willing to discuss this. If we have children being abused and men watching this on the internet, for example, that's one such example.
Thank you, Andreas Karlsson. Christian Democrats. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have every sympathy for several of the proposals mentioned by Jonas Sjöstedt. We back and we've supported the Act on Consent. We've supported other proposals. We want to raise the level of knowledge in the whole law enforcement sector on this type of crime. But the ones that really denigrate an individual in their personal integrity, those types of crimes should be given higher priority, and we want to raise the penalties for sexual crime, and that asylum seekers committing such sexual crime should be expulsed. We feel that we need to defend these issues on a broad scale, but it was the sexual crime that I referred to and the level of punishment, the penalties. I'd like to know more. I agree with many of the things that Jonas Sjöstedt said, but I'd like to know your stance on raised penalties.
Jonas Sjöstedt. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do think that what we propose will have much more of an effect. It's easy to say that we'll have more severe penalties, but I don't think it will do much. I think the problem is completely different. I've talked about this. I've talked about the changes to legislation we want to see, and I've also talked about where we want to see a higher penalty scale. In Sweden, if you commit a serious crime, you can be expelled from the country. I think that's good, but it should also work in practice. But to have different scales penalties depending on what background an individual has, that is not correct. If you commit a crime, the penalty should be the same for everyone in Sweden, and expulsion is something we can use and should be using when it's warranted. From a historical perspective, I don't think that you, the Christian Democrats, that you have much to be proud of, because you usually try to slow down developments, and we have tried to increase the speed when it comes to changes, equal rights, and to fight sexual crime, for example.
Thank you. That concludes the rejoinders on Jonas Sjöstedt's address. Now the floor to Jan Björklund for his address.
Herr talman, det är...
Mr. Speaker, the economy is doing well in Sweden and in large parts of Western Europe, and what's so difficult to understand is why the government isn't using this to get through with more reforms. Stefan Löfven had one prioritized promise in the election campaign. Sweden would have the lowest unemployment in the EU by 2020. We argued that measuring it this way is not relevant. No, Mr. Löfven insisted. And what's the status right now? We are to be ahead of the other 27 countries, 1 out of 28 in the EU. So let's have a look. When the alliance government came into power in 2006, Sweden was in 15th position. We improved it. We improved on it in spite of the downturn in the economy, up to 12th position. So Sweden was in 12th position when Stefan Löfven came into power in 2014. What about 2015? We were still in 12th place, and 2016 still in 12th. But now the European Commission has suggested that Sweden will drop by 2018 down to place 13, and a majority of the time has elapsed, and Sweden has in fact dropped in the ratings. This was to be the all-encompassing objective. They can't do anything, said Mr. Löfven, unless it contributes to reducing the unemployment. We will have the lowest unemployment in the EU, he said. So the question that Stefan Löfven need to ask themselves is, when are we going to start climbing from position 13? Are you going to do all of it in the final year 2020 perhaps? And why is it important? Well, it is important because now we have an even greater challenge with all the low-skilled new arrivals into this country, and we need measures to be taken. But you're rolling your thumbs, and every single measure you talked about, trainee jobs and whatnot during the election campaign, have all been disasters. We're lucky in Sweden, you're lucky, and we're lucky in Sweden that we're in an upturn in the economy. What's going to happen in a downturn? You're preparing for that in a very poor manner indeed, because you need measures to reduce thresholds and bring more people into jobs in Sweden.
Jan Björklund.
Thank you to Jan Björklund. And rejoinders have been requested by Stefan Löfven, Kristoffer Löfven and Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party. We'll start with the Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, an Alliance Party leader saying that I'm lucky. Now, in your period in power, unemployment increased, youth unemployment increased, long-term unemployment increased, and in our time in power, it's decreasing, youth unemployment is decreasing, and also long-term unemployment is decreasing. Is that right or not? One thing that we have to invest in, as correctly as you say, is schools. And it is fantastic for schools, for teachers, for headmasters to see the improved results. And let's hope that that's a new trend. But the inequalities in schools need to be dealt with, which is why we need to do more about that, which is why Gustav Fridolin and I together, we have presented our proposals for this. But why, Jan Björklund? Do you want to get rid of some of the proposals that we're doing in favour of reducing inequalities, in favour of introducing tax cuts for the rich?
Jan Björklund from the Liberals. This is silly, what the Prime Minister is doing. We had the deepest downturn in 80 years in the economy. He's smiling, but those were fairly difficult years, and he was in charge of a trade union back then and had to struggle with it. The deepest one in 80 years, and still we managed to improve from 15th to 12th position on employment in the EU. But you've dropped. The European Commission is suggesting a further drop. You said we were to be best in class, but we're dropping in the ranking. You're sitting back, you're satisfied, you're rolling your thumbs, you're not hungry. We need actions for this to be resolved in the longer term. And yes, it is a good thing to be lucky with the business cycle, but you can't just rely on luck. You need to have measures that will work in a tougher time as well, with headwinds.
Thank you, Mrs. Speaker. I do remember 2008, 2009. There was the president of the trade union, Metal, and contacted the government to say, you have to do something. You didn't do anything. 80,000 industrial jobs disappeared. Thanks a great deal, Jan Björklund. What we're doing now, we've changed the approach. No more tax cuts, no more cutbacks. We're investing in building. When you build, you create jobs, and people have new flats, new homes, and we are investing in infrastructure, in roads. We're investing in schools, in care for the elderly, in medical care, healthcare, and this way we can create jobs. And so you can see we've turned the tide. A lot remains to be done, but we've changed direction. And this is something that we should continue. This is the path we should continue on. We need jobs for everybody, and we need to ensure that we have the lowest level of unemployment by 2020 in the EU. Thank you.
Jan Björklund.
Jan Björklund. You did not change direction. The upturn in the economy did that for you, and it's good. But when it turns again, we're very poorly prepared. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what Stefan Löfven is so proud about in terms of school results. He can be happy that there's an improvement, but he really should thank the Alliance government, because our reforms turned this around. 30 years of very unclear social democratic policy had its impact. We've changed that around. I'm worried that you won't stick to this. You'll go back to a less clear policy. It's there in the Green Party policy documents. Make sure you stay away from it.
That's the end of that round of rejoinders. Next we have Gustav Fridolin. Mr. Speaker, 15 years ago Sweden had one of the most equal education systems in the world. Now, most developed economies are better at reducing inequalities in schools and having an impact on results than Sweden. We are worse at ensuring that all children have access to a good school. And 8 of these 15 years, Jan Björklund has been the Minister for Education. We've met several times to discuss different reasons behind this. And let me look at one, the financial crisis, how it was dealt with. Now, it was the municipalities who had to deal with that. 10,000 people, fewer people were working in schools when we took over as compared to when you came to power. And teachers had less time with pupils. And I think this had the greatest impact on those pupils who need schools. It's not the only reason to these growing inequalities, but don't you believe, Jan Björklund, that cuts in schools is at least one explanation as to why the situation is as it is?
Only a minor one. I believe that there are a number of decisive factors. The first one is that Sweden has taken in so many newly arrived pupils. They won't speak Swedish straight off, and when you're taking them into account, the results will drop. That's a very important reason why we saw the growing gaps, as you called it, because the schools where these immigrant children go are often located in such a way that you get concentrations in various locations. That's not to say that the schools are bad, but we need to work more with those schools and those pupils. They need more time in this at school. We've proposed that they might do more years of compulsory schooling. We've made proposals to raise wages in those areas. You voted down and voted against all our proposals. We need to do more for this group of immigrants, and it's been devastating for the students that many of these children, the students and the pupils, will have to take so much of the responsibility for their own teaching. They need education led by teachers.
Thank you, Mrs. Speaker. What OECD shows us is that the increasing inequalities in Sweden have got nothing to do with new arrivals. In fact, we got a little bit better at dealing with their needs. We're a bit slower perhaps, but they at least increasing their result, improving that. We're in fact learning how to deal with that situation. However, the number of books that parents have in their shelves and the size of the wallet, this is what has a greater impact on school results today than it did 15 years ago. We are worse than most other OECD countries at this. That is something that should scare you, Jan Björklund. Instead, you propose in your budget, you propose cutbacks. You, in fact, want to cut back on the funds that we're talking about here that goes to those schools that have the biggest challenges. Cooperating for the best school where the state works to develop these schools, you want to get rid of that proposal. I don't understand. I don't understand you. I don't understand how you can continue with tax cuts, cutbacks in schools, etc. in this way.
Jan Björklund. Thank you. The Minister for Education apparently has not read the proposals to the government. We propose, my party, more money than any other party to schools. We want to change the focus. We want to raise pay for salaries in marginalised areas even more, because then we can recruit the best teachers to those particular schools. It's much more efficient than the municipal collaboration projects where the municipal councillors have already failed so miserably with the schools will be given more money to play around with. We need to have special targeted measures, not the ones who've arrived in the past 12 months alone, but in some of these housing areas we could have a second generation of immigrants who still perform very poorly with low results. So when the OECD are saying that it's not the new arrivals, no, I can agree that it's not just them, but it's the entire group of people who've come into Sweden, including those in the second generation, and we need to work more with these schools, raising requirements, extending compulsory schooling periods. This is what enhanced and better equality schools is all about, nothing else. Thank you very much. That concludes this round of rejoinders. We'll proceed on our list. Jonas Sjöstedt from the Left Party.
Herr talman, Jan Björklund.
Jan Björklund. Sweden is very sort of topsy-turvy. We have areas in the country which don't have basic services, and many parts of the country don't have access to basic services, which is why we took initiative to a survey on this, and proposal and report was submitted with very concrete proposal. I don't think it's sufficient, but I think it's important. I think it's also important that the parties can discuss this and agree. But there's only one party submitted submitted a reservation against this report, and I'm surprised, because what you worried about was that you want to have good state service like social insurance fund and pension authority. So you didn't want to have that. Why? What's that? What's the reason behind that?
Utmärkt, herr talman, och ha god service.
Jan Björklund, it's perfectly possible to have good services in those areas. I grew up in a smaller community. We need good services across the country, and I very much agree with the idea that we should make the whole country be alive and vibrant. But we can't have government agencies deciding precisely where the government office, the various agency offices should be located. You can't just deal with it at such a detailed level. Some of the things will have to be dealt with independently by the government agencies. We have another proposal that we believe could be more efficient. more effective. We should look at differentiation and how we allocate the travel allocations across the country. You voted against that proposal, but we believe that could have been very important. That's an important difference, you see, on how far you have to travel to work and, of course, also to other things that you need to do in life. You can't just get the underground. That's not the way it works, Jonas Sjöstedt.
But that was incomprehensible, Jan Björklund, because this travelling benefit, this is in fact included in the report. So we are standing here and say that you have instead, well, that's included in the report that you voted against. Well, it's incomprehensible, and I still can't understand what is the problem. Is it sort of a symbolic that you don't care about rural areas in the countryside, that you sort of find sort of make up certain, reasons as to why you vote against, and then you have, it's not like we're talking about a map for social insurance officers, etc. It's about the principle, ensuring that you have good services across the board, and you're against it, and it is incomprehensible. Jan Björklund.
Jan Björklund, Mr. Speaker, Jonas Sjöstedt must have thought for a long time before he decided how to respond to what he wanted to say to me. There's broad support. We're very much in agreement. There's the odd one where we're not agreed. He's in favour of changes to the travel deductions. Why did you vote against it in December if you're in favour now? Did you just discover this on New Year's Eve, perhaps?
Samtliga replik. Samtliga replik.
Thank you. That concludes all the rounds of rejoinders for Jan Björklund. Moving on to Andreas Karlsson for the Christian Democrats for his address.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Should Sweden be strong, if we're going to be strong, we need reforms that increase confidence in society, reinforcing and emancipating individuals and families and our sense of security. These issues need to be discussed a lot more in political debate, regardless of whether we were talking about everyday lives and safeguarding it from crime, or ensuring that we have confidence in healthcare, for example, or economic security for old people through pensions. Now, Mr. Speaker, for the Christian Democrats, the route to society characterised of confidence and faith via an alliance government moving into Rosenbad at the latest after the next general election in 2018. And I'm even more convinced about that after this debate. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. And Gustav Fridolin from the Green Party has requested a rejoinder. You have the floor.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy New Year, Andreas Karlsson and other colleagues. Children in Sweden celebrated Christmas in very different ways. Some waited excitedly for Santa all day, and others waited anxiously to see if their father would get too drunk. Some had so many Christmas presents they couldn't open them all the same evening, and others don't know what to say when friends ask them what they got for Christmas. The Swedish government is determined to break away from child poverty. We want children to grow up in safety, and we're going to do everything in our might to achieve that. But the Christian Democrats are saying no to free glasses for children, or free medication, regardless of how much money their parents earn, or extra money in divorces if no alimony has been paid for 10 years. And they want to reduce the ceiling in some of the allocation systems. Are you just thinking about the voice of some families, not all?
Mr. Speaker, thank you. No, we mean all families, which is why if you'd looked at our budget a bit more carefully, you would see that we have clear reforms for this group that you're highlighting here, that we, the Christian Democrats, we safeguard these groups. We want to have targeted housing benefits, and you did away with other proposals which made it possible for parents who couldn't afford, for example, to buy certain things for their children, sports kit, etc., that that they had access to those funds. And also, I do know that there are many voluntary organisations which do a fantastic job around Christmas supporting these families. And we see that force in society, which is why in our budget we have also reintroduced a rebate for that, because you wanted to do away with that. You wanted a warmer society, but you reduced it through your policies. So yes, emphasize your proposals and your policies in your budget, but don't forget the ones that we presented too.
Thank you. Gustaf Fridolin from Green Party. Mr. Speaker, I fail to understand. The answer from the Christian Democrats on having children grow up in safety is that wealthier people should be able to deduct money for donations that they make, and that you should have a special benefit that you apply for very nicely and politely to be able to afford to buy sports equipment for your children instead of having them as a general grant. You represent that one, but you don't represent a properly protective health insurance social insurance policy. You've said no to free glasses for children regardless of the income of their parents, or medication to children not based on income. And you don't want money to single parents. Single parents are some of the hardest hit by the financial crisis and financial difficulties. They are really lagging behind. Children growing up with single parents have had a very tough situation and still have. Why do you consistently want to freeze the raises in benefit levels for that group? Is it a point of principle that you're opposed to divorces?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If you want to misunderstand what I said, well, please do. But I've put forward several proposals that you have, in fact, voted against, proposals that have helped and supported these families, and we want to do more than that. In fact, we want to raise housing or target housing benefits. We want targeted measures for those who are in worst off. But I think the most important thing is that more people should have jobs. More should have a job to go to, that more children see their mum and dad go to work and that they can make a living themselves. I think that's the most important thing that we can all do, which is why we have a very strong policy to try to break marginalisation and exclusion through, for example, introduction to a job, etc., to make people easier for people to get into employment. I think this is the best way forward, which is why we have so many proposals that favour families and those that are most marginalised. Thank you. Thank you. That is the end of the party leader debate. Thank you.
Man övergår då till att behandla socialutskottets betänkande nummer 4. Kan man övergå då alldeles strax till behandla socialutskottets betänkande nummer 4, ökad tillgänglighet till sprututbytesverksamheter i Sverige. Innan dess så har jag ett antal ärenden att anmäla. Punkt 2, justering av protokoll. Godkänner kammaren protokollen från sammanträdena onsdagen den 7, torsdagen den 8 och fredagen den 9 december. Svaret är ja. Punkt 3, avsägelse. Olle Fälten, Sverigedemokraterna, avsagt sig uppdraget som suppleant i Riksbanksfullmäktige. Bifalles den avsägelse. Svaret är ja. Punkt 4, punkt 5, anmälan om kompetensval. Olle Fälten, Sverigedemokraterna, som ledamot i Riksbanksfullmäktige. Jag förklarar honom vald. Mikael Eskilandersson, Sverigedemokraterna, som suppleant i Riksbanksfullmäktige. Jag förklarar honom vald. Punkterna 6-11, ärenden för hänvisning till utskott. Propositioner, framställningar, EU-dokument hänvisas till utskott enligt förslag på föredragningslistan. Punkt 12, ärenden för debatt och avgörande. Och här kommer vi då till socialutskottets betänkande nummer 4. Ordet går till första anmälda talare som är Ann-Britt Åsebull, Moderaterna, som får ordet för anförande. Varsågod.
Herr talman! Det är viktigt att minska smittspridningen av blodburna infektioner bland personer som injicerar narkotika. Främst gäller det infektioner som HIV och hepatit C. En stor del av smittspridningen sker genom att personer med delar orena sprutor och kanyler. Om detta handlar det betänkande som vi nu ska debattera, sprututbytesverksamheter och tillgänglighet. Erfarenheter från de mångåriga verksamheterna och projekten i Malmö och Lund visar att verksamheten tagits emot mycket väl av de personer som missbrukar narkotika. Sprututbytesprogrammet innebär att de som